Hello, my friend. Tonight we walk beside slow rivers beneath enormous dark skies where the first cities flicker like fragile lanterns against endless wilderness. Warm mud presses beneath your sandals. Smoke from cooking fires drifts lazily into cooling evening air. Somewhere nearby, water slaps softly against wooden docks while distant priests chant beneath towering temple walls. You stand at the beginning of recorded memory itself, in a world where storms feel alive and thunder sounds like the voice of a furious god watching humanity from above. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, perhaps wrapped in blankets with rain tapping your window, or a quiet fan humming nearby, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. It is always comforting to see listeners gathering from every corner of the sleeping world. Your breathing slows as torchlight dances across ancient brick streets. Ahead rises the earlier shape of Enlil, lord of windstorms, command, and terrifying divine authority. His name drifts through these river valleys long before mighty empires rise, long before marble palaces, long before history becomes neat enough for textbooks and museum plaques. For now, everything still feels uncertain. You move through southern Mesopotamia where the rivers flood unpredictably and survival depends on cooperation, patience, and luck. Villages cluster beside canals carved carefully by human hands. Reeds sway endlessly beside muddy water. Oxen groan beneath wooden ploughs. Children chase one another between storage jars while exhausted workers patch irrigation walls before another flood arrives. Life feels fragile here. The people of these early settlements do not imagine nature as random machinery. Storms are personalities. Rivers possess moods. Wind carries intention. If lightning strikes nearby, someone somewhere must have offended a hidden power. And above these powers slowly rises Enlil, a being connected with air authority and the invisible force shaping civilization itself. For a moment it feels as though the evening wind changes direction just to announce him. Records discovered by archaeologists, including studies discussed by researchers from the University of Chicago, confirm that some of humanity's earliest cities emerged in this fertile region nearly 6,000 years ago. Those same cities produced the first extensive written references to divine beings resembling Enlil. Yet the stories remain fragmented, almost dreamlike, as though history itself still struggles to awaken fully. You walk farther into the settlement. The scent of damp clay fills the air. Workers mould bricks beside smoky kilns while merchants load baskets of dates, barley and fish from narrow boats. Nearby, a priest watches the sky carefully, not casually. Carefully, because clouds matter here. Wind matters. Silence matters. Everything depends upon invisible balance. Oddly enough, some surviving tablets suggest the earliest priests spent enormous effort interpreting ordinary weather patterns as messages from the gods. A sudden gust during ceremony might alter political decisions. A thunderstorm before harvest could trigger days of ritual offerings. Imagine trying to plan taxes while everyone believes the sky personally dislikes your leadership. Honestly, modern office politics suddenly seem adorable. Still, fear alone does not explain Enlil's rise. You begin noticing something deeper. These growing cities require order. Canals must function. Grain must be stored properly. Labourers need direction. Armies eventually need command. Enlil slowly becomes more than a storm spirit. He transforms into divine authority itself. The god of command, the god who decides. In your ears, the echo of sandals across stone mixes with distant drum beats from a nearby temple courtyard. Oil lamps flicker against walls decorated with painted reeds and stars. Priests move carefully through shadowed halls carrying bowls of grain and fragrant cedar smoke. Their robes whisper softly across brick floors polished by generations of ritual footsteps. Above them rises a temple platform reaching toward the night sky. Not a simple shrine, a statement. These towering structures announce that humanity now organizes itself beneath divine supervision. The gods no longer belong only to forests, rivers, or wandering tribes. They belong to cities, administrations, economies. Enlil becomes the heavenly reflection of organized power on Earth. And power, as humans eventually learn countless times, rarely remains gentle forever. Some historians from Harvard and Oxford argue that Enlil originally represented natural wind patterns before gradually absorbing political authority as urban civilization expanded. Others disagree sharply, insisting he began primarily as a ruler, deity connected with kingship from the very beginning. No agreement has been reached completely. The surviving evidence resembles broken puzzle pieces scattered across thousands of years. Still, one truth remains clear. People feared him deeply. Your mind drifts through crowded streets where labourers haul baskets beneath punishing heat. Farmers kneel beside irrigation trenches, scraping mud with aching hands. A mother hangs woven cloth outside her doorway, while murmuring a prayer toward the temple skyline. Nobody knows whether Enlil feels merciful today. That uncertainty shapes everything. A curious footnote preserved within later Mesopotamian traditions describes Enlil as both creator and destroyer, capable of granting civilization while also threatening to erase it entirely. You can already sense the contradiction forming. The same force bringing order may someday decide humanity itself has become unbearable. Not tonight, though. Tonight the city still hums with fragile optimism. You continue along narrow alleys where musicians pluck soft melodies beside market fires. Dogs bark lazily in distant courtyards. Somewhere nearby, fresh bread crackles inside clay ovens. The world feels alive, ordinary human. Yet above every conversation looms the temple silhouette of Enlil, dark against moonlit clouds. A reminder. Civilization believes it has found stability here between the rivers. But stability depends upon forces nobody fully controls. One failed harvest changes everything. One flood destroys generations of work. One terrible storm turns kings into beggars overnight. And so the people offer prayers. They pour wine beside altars. They burn incense. They whisper promises into the warm night air. They ask Enlil for peace-fertile fields, healthy children, and calm skies. They ask him not to notice their failures too closely. Because ancient gods rarely ignore noise forever. The breeze cools slightly as midnight approaches. Temple singers begin slower chants meant to soothe divine tempers before dawn. Their voices rise gently across rooftops while stars shimmer above the river valleys. You feel the strange intimacy of these early cities. Humanity still stands close to wilderness here, close to fear, close to wonder, close to Enlil. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, history quietly prepares its first great catastrophe. The night deepens around the river cities while cool wind slides softly through tall reeds beside the canals. You continue walking beneath enormous temple walls, listening to distant water wheels creak rhythmically in darkness. Somewhere nearby, an infant cries briefly before falling silent again. The city never fully sleeps. Too much depends upon constant labour. Canals collapse without maintenance. Grain spoils without careful storage. Guards must watch for thieves' floods and rival settlements moving silently beneath moonlight. Civilization still feels experimental. As generations pass, these scattered settlements grow into powerful city-states linked through trade conflict and shared belief. Uruk rises proudly beside crowded markets. Eridu claims sacred antiquity. Niphur slowly becomes the spiritual heart of Enlil's growing authority. Mud brick walls stretch wider every decade. Temple towers climb higher toward the clouds. Human ambition expands with astonishing speed, and Enlil expands beside it. Your sandals scrape dusty streets crowded with merchants carrying wool copper fish oil and carved ivory from distant regions. Donkeys snort impatiently beneath overloaded carts. Perfume sellers wave fragrant smoke through market stalls while scribes press symbols carefully into wet clay tablets. Everywhere you look, order emerges from chaos through endless coordination. Someone must oversee it all. For many ancient people, that someone becomes Enlil. Records examined by researchers from Yale and Princeton indicate that by the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Enlil occupied one of the highest positions within the Mesopotamian divine world. His authority reached beyond weather alone. He governed kingship law, agriculture, and cosmic structure itself. Rulers seeking legitimacy often travelled to sacred centres connected with his worship before claiming political authority publicly. Because earthly power required heavenly approval. You pass beneath a massive wooden gate reinforced with bronze fittings blackened by age and smoke. Beyond it stands a crowded ceremonial avenue leading toward Enlil's sanctuary. Priests carrying tall reed torches guide noble visitors through carefully organised processions. Musicians strike drums slowly enough to echo against surrounding walls like distant thunder. The atmosphere feels deliberate. Every movement teaches obedience. For a moment it feels as though the city itself breathes according to ritual timing. Bakers begin work before dawn offerings. Labourers pause during sacred announcements. Even merchants lower their voices when temple officials pass nearby. Religion here does not exist separately from government or economy. It wraps around daily existence completely, like wind around stone towers. A council decree uncovered near ancient Nippur proves temple institutions controlled enormous agricultural resources. Vast fields, livestock herds, fishing operations and warehouses belong directly to religious authorities serving Enlil. Priests manage workers, recorded harvests, distributed supplies, and influence political alliances across neighbouring cities. In simple terms, the temple operated like a giant corporation with divine branding, except employees genuinely feared supernatural punishment. You move deeper into Nippur itself, the sacred city most closely associated with Enlil. Unlike heavily fortified capitals focused mainly on military power, Nippur exists primarily as a spiritual centre. Pilgrims arrive constantly. Kings donate extravagant gifts. Ceremonies continue throughout the year, beneath drifting clouds of incense and cedar smoke. The scent lingers everywhere. Inside busy courtyards, apprentices grind pigments for temple murals while elderly priests debate omens beside bowls of oil and water. Young servants carry woven baskets overflowing with barley cakes meant for ritual offerings. Nearby musicians rehearse hymns praising Enlil as a guardian of order and dispenser of fate. One surviving hymn describes him as the force separating heaven from earth itself. Not subtle praise. Your mind drifts upwards toward the towering temple complex called the Ika, often translated loosely as the mountain house. The name alone reveals something important. Southern Mesopotamia contains few natural mountains. Flat horizons dominate the landscape. So temples become symbolic mountains connecting humanity with the divine realms above. Enlil rules from an artificial peak built by human devotion. The symbolism works beautifully. You climb broad stairways illuminated by flickering oil lamps while cool night air brushes your skin. From higher terraces, the city stretches endlessly below. Canals reflect moonlight like silver threads weaving through dark neighbourhoods. Dogs bark faintly near distant workshops. Somewhere below, a drunk merchant sings terribly off-key, while friends laugh beside a beer jar. Even ancient civilization includes karaoke disasters, yet above ordinary life stands the terrifying dignity of the temple. Here silence grows heavier. Priests wash carefully before entering sacred chambers. Ritual objects remain polished with obsessive care. Every detail suggests humanity trying desperately to maintain cosmic balance through proper ceremony, because disorder frightens people living this close to catastrophe. Studies discussed by historians at Stanford suggest unpredictable flooding patterns strongly influence Mesopotamian religious psychology. Unlike the more stable Nile River floods in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers could become violently destructive without warning. Communities surviving these conditions often imagine divine powers as temperamental, forceful, and demanding. Enlil fits this environment perfectly. A curious surviving tablet even portrays him punishing lesser beings for disrupting sacred order through noise and chaos. You notice how often sound appears within these traditions. Loudness symbolizes rebellion. Clamour threatens stability. Human beings multiplying noisily across the earth eventually become in mythic terms an irritation to divine concentration itself. Anxious parents everywhere probably understand the emotion. Still, Enlil remains more than a cruel figure. Farmers pray to him sincerely before planting crops. Kings ask his guidance before negotiations. Families dedicate children to temple service, hoping for protection and prosperity. Fear and devotion mingle together until separating them becomes impossible. The wind strengthens slightly across the temple terraces. Blowtorches sway beside narrow streets where workers continue repairing canal walls through the night. Their labour matters enormously. Without irrigation systems, these great cities vanish quickly beneath drought and hunger. Civilization survives only through cooperation directed by strong authority. And Enlil represents authority elevated beyond human argument. Scholars from Cambridge and Columbia continue debating whether ordinary citizens truly believe the gods physically controlled daily events, or whether many rituals functioned partly as political theatre supporting social order. Arguments split sharply along interpretation of surviving texts. Some historians emphasize genuine spiritual devotion. Others focus more heavily on institutional power. Perhaps both explanations remain true simultaneously. Human beings often believe sincerely in systems that also benefit existing authority structures. Ancient Mesopotamia hardly invented that habit. In your ears, distant temple bells mark approaching dawn. Soft pink light begins spreading slowly across the eastern horizon. Birds flutter awake beside reed marshes. Bakers reopen clay ovens, while sleepy guards trade shifts beside city gates. Another day begins beneath Enlil's watchful presence, and with each passing generation his influence grows stronger. Soon kings will claim entire empires through his blessing. Soon flood legends will darken into terrifying warnings. Soon humanity itself will stand accused before the storm god who once helped civilization rise from mud and river water. But for now the city simply wakes, quietly, carefully, hoping the wind remains gentle today. Dawn light spreads softly across Nippur, while temple servants sweep yesterday's dust from broad stone courtyards. Cool air carries the scent of wet clay, burnt cedar, and fresh bread rising from ovens below the sacred terraces. You remain high above the waking city, standing before the enormous sanctuary of Enlil, where priests already begin another long cycle of ritual calculation and political negotiation disguised as divine service. The temple never truly rests. Inside the Ekur, every hallway seems designed to humble visitors. Massive walls block outside noise. Narrow windows admit careful shafts of sunlight. Painted reliefs depict gods towering above tiny human figures carrying offerings with bowed heads. Even your footsteps sound smaller here. Authority echoes beautifully in silence. You pass beneath hanging woven curtains darkened by years of incense smoke. Nearby, young attendants polish bronze bowls until they reflect wavering torchlight like pools of liquid fire. Elder priests whisper instructions while scribes organize clay tablets recording harvest totals, livestock counts, trade agreements, and ritual schedules. This place governs souls and storage inventories simultaneously. Records studied by scholars from the University of California and Oxford confirm that Mesopotamian temples functioned as major economic institutions, not merely spiritual centers. Large temple complexes employed farmers, craftsmen, scribes, brewers, herders, and laborers. In many cities, religious administration shaped nearly every aspect of organized life. You can feel that machinery operating around you now. For a moment, it feels as though the sanctuary itself watches carefully, measuring every sound and gesture. The priests serving Enlil move with practiced precision because mistakes carry frightening consequences. An improperly spoken prayer might offend divine authority. A forgotten offering could invite disaster upon entire communities. At least that is what everyone fears. The scent of myrrh thickens as you enter an inner chamber, illuminated by small oil lamps arranged carefully along stone shelves. Here, senior priests interpret omens through rituals modern listeners might find both fascinating and slightly unsettling. They study unusual cloud formations. They examine animal organs after sacrifices. They monitor star movements with obsessive attention. Ancient risk management looked dramatic. A preserved ritual text reveals that priests sometimes interpreted tiny irregularities during ceremonies as warnings from Enlil himself. A flickering flame, an unexpected noise, even the behavior of birds near temple roofs could influence official decisions. Imagine trying to finalize irrigation policy while someone insists a nervous pigeon represents cosmic disapproval. Still, these practices emerge from genuine uncertainty. The world surrounding Mesopotamia remains dangerous and unstable. Floods arrive suddenly. Drought ruins harvests. Disease spreads through crowded cities without warning. The people here crave signs explaining why suffering appears and whether catastrophe can be avoided. Enlil becomes the voice assigning meaning to chaos. Your fingers brush rough mud brick walls cool from the night air. The texture feels ancient beyond comprehension. Generations of worshippers have touched these same surfaces while asking for mercy, wealth, children, victory, or simple survival through another harvest season. Some prayers probably sounded remarkably familiar. Please protect my family. Please spare the crops. Please make tomorrow easier. Humanity changes clothing styles more quickly than emotional needs. You continue deeper into the sanctuary where only elite officials and high priests may enter freely. Guards carrying spears stand motionless beside carved doorways. Their expressions remain unreadable beneath braided beards and heavy wool garments. Beyond them waits the sacred chamber associated directly with Enlil's presence on Earth. The room feels unexpectedly small. Not empty, though. Heavy silence presses against your ears while perfumed smoke curls lazily towards shadowed ceilings. Offerings of grain fruit beer and carved jewellery rest carefully upon low altars. Somewhere hidden nearby, musicians play slow repetitive melodies designed to calm divine tempers and focus human minds. The atmosphere feels intimate rather than grand, as though enormous power prefers whispers. Researchers from Harvard have noted that Mesopotamian religion often emphasized maintaining harmony between divine and earthly realms through continuous ritual attention. Gods required service. Humans required protection. The relationship resembled an uneasy agreement where stability depended upon everyone performing expected roles correctly, and Enlil sat near the top of that arrangement. One scandalous aside preserved within later writings hints that temple leadership occasionally struggled with corruption, political favoritism, and internal rivalries. Apparently, ancient priests, despite commanding divine authority, remained astonishingly human. When wealth and influence entered the conversation, some traditions never disappear. Outside the sanctuary, morning activity intensifies across Nippur. You hear merchants calling prices through crowded streets while labourers drag timber toward construction sites near canal walls. Noble officials arrive carrying tribute from neighbouring cities, hoping to secure Enlil's favour through lavish donations, because sacred approval translates into political legitimacy. A ruler ignored by Enlil risks appearing weak before rivals. Your mind drifts toward royal ceremonies held within these temple courts. Kings kneel publicly before priesthood serving the storm god. Crowns receive blessings beneath drifting incense clouds. Victorious generals dedicate captured treasure after military campaigns. Every performance reinforces the same message repeatedly. Earthly authority flows downward from divine command. No argument permitted. Historians from Yale and Cambridge continue debating how sincerely Mesopotamian rulers believed their own sacred propaganda. Some scholars argue kings genuinely considered themselves chosen servants of divine will. Others suspect many leaders used religion strategically to strengthen political control across fragile urban populations. No final consensus exists. The ancient evidence leaves room for both ambition and faith. Perhaps rulers believed their ceremonies sincerely during prosperous years and strategically during difficult ones. Human psychology rarely divides neatly. The wind shifts suddenly outside the temple walls. Reed banners flutter sharply against wooden poles, while distant thunder murmurs somewhere beyond the horizon. Several priests pause mid-conversation and glance upward instinctively. Even in now weather, their changes command attention. You follow them onto an elevated terrace overlooking vast canal networks stretching across the plains. Farmers already work fields beyond the city boundaries, tiny figures moving steadily through green patches carved from difficult land. Without irrigation systems, these fields would dry quickly beneath relentless sun and dust. Civilization here remains an ongoing negotiation with nature, and nature often sounds like Enlil. A curious hymn discovered among fragmented tablets praises him not only for storms, but also for separating civilized humanity from wilderness chaos. Order itself becomes sacred. Boundaries matter enormously. Cities represent fragile islands of structure surrounded by uncertainty. That idea carries tremendous power, especially when leaders control access to divine reassurance. In your ears, temple singers begin another layered chant rolling slowly across the terraces like approaching rain clouds. Their voices blend with distant hammering from workshops below, and the constant soft rush of canal water moving through carefully engineered channels. Everything feels interconnected. Religion, government, agriculture, fear, hope, all woven tightly beneath the invisible authority of Enlil. And somewhere beyond those distant storm clouds, stories already begin forming about a future moment when humanity, noise, ambition, and endless expansion may finally provoke the god beyond forgiveness. The storm clouds gather slowly across the distant plains, while morning heat rises from the brick streets of Nippur. You descend from the temple terraces into crowded avenues where scribes hurry beside donkey carts and labourers wipe sweat from their foreheads with rough-woven cloth. Life moves carefully beneath the authority of Enlil, yet ambition now spreads through Mesopotamia faster than river water after spring floods. Kings begin dreaming larger dreams. Not merely surviving another season, not merely defending one city wall. They imagine domination across entire regions, and every ruler understands one essential truth immediately. Armies alone cannot secure lasting obedience. People must believe heaven itself approves the throne. And so the kings come seeking Enlil. You stand beside a ceremonial roadway lined with fluttering banners dyed deep red and faded gold. Temple musicians beat slow rhythms while priests scatter fragrant herbs across packed earth. Citizens crowd the edges of the avenue, whispering excitedly as royal envoys approach through clouds of dust. The procession looks impressive on purpose. Bronze weapons gleam beneath harsh sunlight. Chariot wheels creak loudly over stone. Soldiers march with exhausting discipline, while servants carry carved boxes overflowing with silver lapis cedarwood and embroidered textiles destined for the temple treasury. At the centre rides a regional king hoping to strengthen his fragile claim through sacred approval. Without divine favour, power feels temporary. Records examined by historians from Princeton and Stanford confirm that Mesopotamian rulers frequently linked their legitimacy directly to Enlil's blessing. Royal inscriptions often described kings as chosen shepherds appointed by the god himself. Victories became evidence of heavenly support. Defeat suggested dangerous divine displeasure. Politics and theology now sleep in the same bed. You watch the king dismount before the temple entrance. Dust clings to his sandals despite the luxurious robes draped across his shoulders. For a brief moment he appears less like a conqueror and more like an anxious petitioner waiting outside an important office. Because that's exactly what he is. Priests greet him formally beneath drifting incense smoke. Ritual greetings unfold carefully according to tradition older than memory itself. Musicians lower their instruments. Guards bow their heads. Even the king speaks softly while entering the sacred courtyard associated with Enlil's judgment. Authority recognizes higher authority. Inside the temple, servants arrange offerings upon polished altars while scribes prepare official records preserving every detail of royal donations. Grain shipments, livestock numbers, precious metals, ceremonial weapons, nothing escapes documentation. Ancient bureaucracy thrives beautifully beneath sacred architecture. Honestly, somewhere a modern accountant would feel deeply understood here. The scent of cedar resin thickens around you as chanting begins inside the sanctuary halls. The king kneels before Enlil's priests while prayers request stable harvests, obedient subjects, military success, and favourable omens. Outside, ordinary citizens wait anxiously for signs indicating whether the god accepts these appeals. Because royal decisions affect everyone. If Enlil approves a campaign, thousands march toward war. If Enlil condemns a rival city, destruction may follow. A surviving inscription discovered near ancient Nippur records one ruler claiming Enlil granted him authority over all neighbouring lands after successful military victories. Yet historians from Columbia and Oxford caution that such declarations function partly as propaganda. Kings presented themselves as chosen because chosen rulers encounter less resistance. At least in theory, human beings remain wonderfully stubborn about authority throughout every century. Your mind drifts away from the temple toward ordinary neighbourhoods beyond the ceremonial districts. Here the grandeur fades quickly into daily exhaustion. Women carry heavy jars from communal wells. Fishermen repair torn nets beside muddy canals. Children chase stray dogs through narrow alleys while elderly workers sort barley beneath patched awnings. Life feels harder here. The divine order praised inside temples often translates into taxes, labour duties, and military service for common families. Farmers surrender portions of harvest to temple warehouses. Craftsmen fulfill quotas demanded by administrators. Young men march away during campaigns promising glory, but frequently delivering grief. Enlil's authority reaches everywhere. A curious legal tablet suggests workers occasionally complained about unfair grain distributions connected with temple management. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, people apparently gathered after exhausting labour to mutter that leadership had become incompetent. Some conversations survive every civilization. Still, many citizens genuinely trust Enlil's protection. During droughts, they organize public ceremonies asking mercy from the storm god. During epidemics, families place offerings near household shrines, hoping divine anger passes over their homes. Faith becomes emotional shelter against uncertainty. You walk beside a canal where water reflects blazing afternoon sunlight like shattered mirrors. Farmers guide oxen through muddy fields while birds circle lazily overhead. Nearby, an elderly woman burns herbs beside a small clay altar and whispers prayers beneath her breath. The scene feels deeply personal, not grand theology. Just one human being hoping tomorrow remains survivable. Researchers from Yale have argued that Mesopotamian religion succeeded partly because it connected cosmic order with ordinary survival needs. Weather patterns, crop cycles, political stability, and spiritual meaning merged together completely. Gods did not exist abstractly. They shaped practical existence every day, and Enlil stood near the centre of that system. No agreement has been reached among scholars regarding how ordinary people emotionally perceived him. Some surviving hymns portray profound devotion and gratitude. Other texts emphasize fear, submission, and anxiety before overwhelming divine power. Arguments split sharply because human relationships with authority rarely remain simple, especially divine authority. As evening approaches, the city cools gradually beneath streaks of orange and purple spreading across the sky. Market stalls close one by one, temple fires brighten against darkening walls. Somewhere nearby, musicians begin softer melodies drifting through open courtyards scented with roasted onions and fresh bread. The world feels briefly peaceful, yet beneath that calm competition intensifies across Mesopotamia. Rival kings seek greater territories. Temple institutions accumulate expanding wealth. Cities boast increasingly massive monuments honouring their patron gods. Human ambition grows louder every generation, and noise, as you may remember, matters greatly in stories surrounding Enlil. In your ears, distant thunder rolls again across the horizon. Citizens pause instinctively. Priests glance upward from temple stairways. Workers hurry indoors carrying tools and baskets before rainfall arrives. The storm god speaks through weather, or perhaps humanity simply hears meaning inside unpredictable skies because uncertainty frightens the heart. Either way, the relationship between Enlil and civilization grows more dangerous with every passing century. The god who grants kingship may someday decide kings and commoners alike have become unbearable burdens upon the earth. For now, though, the cities continue expanding beside the rivers. Busy, proud, and increasingly loud. Night rain finally arrives across the river, plains falling in soft, uneven rhythms against rooftops, canals, and temple terraces. You sit beneath a covered walkway near the edge of Nippur, while storm winds stir hanging reed curtains beside the sanctuary walls. Lightning flickers silently beyond distant fields. Nearby, a tired scribe warms his hands around a clay cup of beer, while older priests exchange uneasy stories about floods from generations long forgotten. Stories grow larger during storms, especially in civilizations built beside unpredictable rivers. The scent of wet earth rises heavily into the cool air. Water trickles through stone drainage channels beneath your feet while torch flames sway nervously against damp walls. Somewhere nearby, thunder cracks hard enough to silence conversations across the courtyard. Everyone listens afterward, because weather still feels personal here. As centuries pass, Mesopotamian flood stories spread from city to city, changing slightly with each retelling. Some accounts describe rivers overwhelming entire settlements after relentless rain. Others speak of divine punishment sent deliberately against noisy, disobedient humanity. Over time, these memories and fears merge together into something mythic, terrifying, and unforgettable. Enlil stands at the centre of it. Your mind drifts toward crowded riverbanks during spring flooding season. Workers stack sandbags desperately beside collapsing canals. Families carry children and grain supplies toward higher ground, while livestock scream against rising currents. Boats smash into wooden docks. Mud walls dissolve beneath endless rainwater. Disaster arrives fast here. Researchers from Cambridge and the University of Chicago note that southern Mesopotamia experienced repeated destructive floods throughout ancient history. Geological evidence suggests several major flood events deeply affected regional settlements, though no single flood covered the entire world literally. Still, traumatic disasters leave emotional scars powerful enough to inspire enduring legends, and legends rarely remain modest. Inside the temple complex, priests recite old hymns asking Enlil for restraint while incense smoke coils through dim chambers thick with humidity. The atmosphere feels tense tonight. Citizens crowd beneath covered courtyards whispering prayers while rainwater drums steadily upon tiled roofs. For a moment it feels as though the entire city waits nervously for judgment. One surviving tablet describes humanity multiplying across the earth until their collective noise disturbs the gods themselves. The imagery feels strangely intimate, not evil, not rebellion exactly, simply endless human activity becoming unbearable to divine ears. Imagine cosmic neighbours pounding angrily on the ceiling, yet beneath the almost dark humour hides something darker. Ancient societies often viewed natural catastrophe through moral lenses. If floods destroyed communities, perhaps humanity deserved punishment somehow. Order had failed. Balance collapsed. The gods responded. And Enlil, lord of authority and storms, becomes the divine force deciding enough is enough. You walk through narrow streets where rainwater rushes beside doorways carrying bits of straw-broken pottery and floating oil residue toward larger canals. Families huddle indoors around dim lamps, while outside the storm reshapes familiar roads into muddy rivers. The city suddenly feels fragile again. A curious fragment preserved from later traditions claims Enlil initially attempted smaller punishments before choosing catastrophic floodwaters. Disease, drought, famine. Humanity survived them all and continued multiplying noisily across the land. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the pattern reveals ancient anxiety about overcrowding disorder and environmental instability. Civilization fears its own growth. Scholars from Harvard and Yale continued debating how these flood traditions developed across Mesopotamia and neighboring cultures. Some researchers argue the myths preserve distorted memories of genuine regional disasters. Others emphasize political and religious symbolism concerning divine authority over human arrogance. No final agreement fully settles the question. Perhaps that uncertainty keeps the stories alive. Rain intensifies across the city. Temple bells ring slowly through darkness while priests organize emergency offerings near Enlil's sanctuary. Citizens bring grain fish oil, woven cloth, and carved amulets, hoping devotion might soften divine anger. Fear changes human behavior quickly. The smell of soaked wool and burning cedar fills crowded corridors as exhausted workers stumble indoors after reinforcing canal barriers throughout the evening. Children sleep beside storage jars while adults remain awake listening to storm winds claw against shutters and doors. Outside, the rivers continue rising. Records confirm that Mesopotamian cities depended entirely upon complex irrigation systems vulnerable to sudden environmental disruption. Researchers from Stanford have noted that even temporary flooding disasters could destroy harvests, weaken political authority, and trigger migration across entire regions. In other words, catastrophe threatened civilization constantly. No wonder the people imagined divine personalities behind the weather. Your thoughts drift toward Enlil himself as ancient storytellers slowly reshape his image through generations of retelling. He no longer appears merely as guardian of kingship and order. Now he becomes something heavier. A god capable of deciding humanity's existence has become intolerable. That transformation matters deep, because once a civilization imagines divine destruction on a massive scale, every storm begins carrying symbolic weight beyond ordinary weather. Thunder becomes warning, floodwater becomes judgment, survival itself starts feeling conditional. A scandalous aside from one later commentary even suggests certain priests used flood fear strategically during political instability, urging stricter obedience to temple authority in order to avoid divine punishment. Human institutions occasionally discover fear motivates people quite efficiently. Not exactly a lost technique. Still, ordinary devotion remains sincere for countless families. A mother lighting incense beside her doorway during heavy rain probably cares little about theological manipulation. She simply wants her children alive tomorrow morning. That emotional truth survives every century. In your ears, rain softens gradually into gentle dripping from rooftops and palm leaves. The worst of the storm finally moves eastward across the plains. Citizens emerge cautiously from shelters while temple attendants inspect water levels beside the canals. Relief spreads slowly, yet the stories remain. The idea that Enlil once considered humanity dangerously loud will continue growing across generations until it becomes one of the ancient world's greatest surviving myths. A divine decision, a terrible flood, a nearly erased civilization. And somewhere within those stories waits one human being chosen to survive while the world drowns around him. But tonight, for now, the city simply breathes again beneath clearing skies. Wet streets glimmer beneath torchlight. Priests thank Enlil for mercy. Workers return cautiously toward damaged canals. And far above the river valleys, thunder fades into silence. Morning mist hangs low above the canals after the storm turning the river plains silver beneath weak sunlight. Water drips steadily from temple roofs, while exhausted workers inspect cracked embankments along the city edges. You walk slowly through damp streets where the smell of wet reeds, fish, and cooling clay ovens mixes with lingering incense from overnight prayers. The city survived this time. But the old flood stories continue spreading quietly from mouth to mouth, growing sharper with every retelling. Priests recite them beside temple fires, Merchants repeat them during long river journeys. Grandparents whisper them to restless children while winds rattle shutters after dark. And at the centre of those stories stands one unforgettable figure, the survivor. Your footsteps echo softly inside a shaded archive room where scribes preserve ancient tablets upon wooden shelves lined carefully against mud brick walls. Dust floats through narrow beams of sunlight. Nearby, an elderly priest traces worn symbols with trembling fingers, while apprentices listen in respectful silence. The tale unfolds slowly here. Humanity multiplies across the earth. Cities span noisily beside rivers and fields. Songs, arguments, celebrations, hammering tools, barking dogs, crying. Infants and crowded marketplaces rise endlessly toward the heavens. According to the myth, Enlil eventually grows weary of the constant clamour. Not hatred exactly, exhaustion. One surviving version describes the god lying awake disturbed by humanity's noise until divine patience finally breaks. Modern listeners might almost laugh briefly at the image. An ancient storm god unable to sleep because civilization became too loud. Yet beneath the strange detail lies profound anxiety about population disorder and fragile balance. Too much growth becomes dangerous. Researchers from Oxford and Columbia note that Mesopotamian flood narratives evolved through multiple overlapping traditions preserved across centuries. The best-known surviving account appears within the Epic of Gilgamesh, though older versions existed long before that text reached final form. These stories likely combined historical flood memories with spiritual reflections on mortality and divine authority. The emotional power remains astonishing even now. You sit beside flickering oil lamps while the priest continues reciting from memory. Enlil gathers the gods and declares humanity must be destroyed through overwhelming floodwaters. Rivers will rise beyond imagination. Storms will erase cities completely. Civilization itself will vanish beneath endless water and darkness. The decision feels terrifyingly final. Yet not every divine being agrees. For a moment it feels as though tension fills the chamber itself, while rainwater still drips faintly outside the archive walls. The old priest lowers his voice while describing another god secretly warning a righteous man about the coming catastrophe. Build a great boat. Take your family. Save animal seeds and essential knowledge. Do not tell the others. The atmosphere changes immediately from doom into desperate preparation. A curious detail preserved within several versions describes neighbours mocking the survivor while he constructs the enormous vessel far from obvious waterways. Imagine spending months building a giant boat while confused villagers walk past carrying vegetables and asking uncomfortable questions. Ancient suburban gossip must have been ruthless. Still, the chosen man continues working. Workers haul timber beneath scorching heat. Pitch seals the hull against future waters. Supplies disappear into storage compartments while skies gradually darken with gathering storms. You can almost hear the hammering. Studies discussed by historians from Harvard suggest these flood stories resonated deeply because a Mesopotamian audiences understood environmental vulnerability intimately. Entire communities depended upon delicate river systems capable of sudden devastation. The myths transformed familiar fears into cosmic drama involving divine judgment and survival. In other words, the stories felt bleak. You walk mentally beside the growing vessel while anxious winds sweep across empty plains. Birds circle overhead strangely. Livestock grow restless. Temple fires flicker unpredictably against gathering clouds. Somewhere nearby, priests continue ordinary rituals, unaware the world supposedly approaches its ending. That contrast feels haunting. People buying bread, children chasing dogs, merchants arguing prices. All while disaster waits silently beyond the horizon. No agreement exists among scholars regarding whether ancient listeners interpreted these stories literally symbolically or somewhere between those extremes. Researchers from Yale and Stanford continue debating how myth functioned within Mesopotamian society. Some argue flood narratives reinforced obedience toward divine authority. Others emphasize emotional reflection on human fragility before natural forces. Perhaps the stories survive because both interpretations feel true. The old priest's voice grows softer while describing the beginning of the flood itself. Black clouds swallow daylight. Winds scream across the plains, hard enough to tear roofs from houses. Rivers burst through canals and walls while terrified crowds flee toward collapsing temples. Then comes water, everywhere. Short sentence. The descriptions become almost dreamlike. Boats crash into palace towers. Livestock drown beside floating market stalls. Families cling desperately to debris beneath roaring skies. Even the gods, according to some versions, recoil fearfully from the destruction unleashed through Enlil's command. That detail matters enormously. The divine beings themselves seem shocked by the scale of catastrophe. A preserved tablet examined by researchers from the University of Chicago describes the flood lasting several days before silence finally settles over the drowned world. Imagine that silence after endless storm noise. No markets, no songs, no hammering tools, only water stretching endlessly beneath empty skies. Human civilization erased, or nearly erased. The survivor's boat drifts alone through darkness, carrying the last fragile pieces of earthly life. Inside, families wait nervously beside animals and dwindling supplies, while outside the storm god's judgment reshapes existence itself. Your breathing slows with the rhythm of imagined waves striking wooden hulls beneath cold rain. The story feels both enormous and strangely intimate. One family trapped inside uncertainty while the old world disappears beyond sight. A scandalous scholarly debate continues over whether later flood traditions from neighbouring cultures borrowed directly from Mesopotamian sources or developed independently from shared disaster experiences. Arguments split sharply among historians, linguists, and archaeologists examining ancient textual connections. Humanity apparently enjoys debating floods almost as much as surviving them. In your ears, the old priest finishes the tale quietly. Eventually the waters recede. The survivor emerges carefully into a transformed world beneath clearing skies. Offerings rise toward heaven again. Humanity begins once more. And Enlil, the god who tried destroying civilization itself, remains woven forever into memory as both creator of order and bringer of catastrophe. The contradiction never fully disappears. The floodwaters withdraw slowly from the imagination of Mesopotamia, leaving behind silence, mud, and uneasy question. You walk across damp plains beneath pale morning skies where reeds bend gently beside swollen canals. Birds return first, then scattered fishermen, then merchants carrying cautious hope inside weathered baskets and patched boats. Civilization begins again carefully. The old stories describe survivors stepping onto drying earth with trembling relief, while broken branches and shattered debris covered the landscape around them. Whether remembered from genuine disaster or shaped through centuries of storytelling, the emotional image remains powerful. Humanity stands fragile beneath enormous skies, wondering if the gods still consider them worthy of existence. Especially Enlil. Cool wind brushes your face while you follow narrow pathways toward recovering settlements beside the rivers. Workers rebuild collapsed embankments with aching arms. Families reshape mud bricks beneath the sun. Temple singers restore damaged sanctuaries, one cracked wall at a time. Life insists on returning. A preserved account from later Mesopotamian tradition describes the survivor offering sacrifices immediately after reaching dry land. Fragrant smoke rises toward heaven, while the gods gather around the scent almost hungrily, reminding listeners that divine beings in these stories depend partly upon human devotion and offerings. Even gods dislike empty silence forever. Researchers from Cambridge and Princeton note that post-flood narratives often focus less on destruction itself and more upon restoration of cosmic balance. The world must be reordered after chaos. Rituals resume. Agriculture restarts. Human communities rebuild relationships with divine authority. Because civilization cannot remain suspended in catastrophe indefinitely. You pass through a recovering neighborhood where women spread grain beneath woven mats to dry in sunlight. Children carry buckets from restored wells while elderly workers scrape flood residue from storage jars. The air smells strongly of mud smoke and river weeds baking beneath afternoon heat. Everything feels exhausted, yet determined. For a moment, it feels as though the cities themselves have learned humility. Temple processions move slower now. Priests speak more carefully during ceremonies. Even kings appear cautious, while claiming divine favor before populations still haunted by flood memories. Fear reshapes behavior for generations. Records examined by historians from Yale suggest many Mesopotamian rulers framed themselves as restorers of order following periods of disaster or instability. Rebuilding canals, temples, and city walls carried spiritual meaning alongside practical necessity. Leadership became proof that divine harmony had returned after chaos, and naturally Enlil remained central to that harmony. You climb partially repaired temple stairs where fresh plaster still dries beneath woven coverings. Priests relight ceremonial fires extinguished during earlier storms. The scent of cedar smoke drifts upward into warm evening air while musicians rehearse hymns praising divine mercy alongside divine power. The balance feels delicate. One curious surviving hymn praises Enlil for both destroying and renewing the world, presenting catastrophe almost as painful correction rather than pure cruelty. Modern listeners may find the logic uncomfortable, yet ancient societies often interpreted suffering through cycles of collapse and restoration. Fields flood, cities rebuild, dynasties rise, dynasties fall. The pattern becomes almost seasonal. Your fingers brush newly repaired brickwork still rough beneath drying clay. Nearby, a young apprentice carefully copies older flood accounts onto fresh tablets because memory matters deeply now. The catastrophe must not vanish completely from cultural consciousness. Stories preserve warnings. Scholars from Stanford and Oxford continue debating whether ancient flood myths primarily reflected environmental trauma or broader philosophical concerns about human limitations. Some researchers emphasize climate instability and river disasters. Others argue the narratives explore timeless questions regarding mortality obedience and the dangers of excessive pride. No final answer satisfies everyone. Perhaps ancient storytellers intentionally left room for uncertainty because uncertainty itself defines human existence beside unpredictable forces. As evening approaches, marketplaces reopen fully across the recovering cities. Merchants sell onions, dates, woven sandals, fish oil, and rough beer beneath fluttering cloth awnings. Musicians return to crowded courtyards. Children laugh again beside canals reflecting soft orange light from the setting sun. The sound matters. Remember how silence followed the flood. Now noise returns gradually, almost cautiously, as though humanity wonders whether Enlil still listens with irritation from above. A scandalous aside preserved in one commentary claimed certain priests warned citizens against excessive celebration after disasters, fearing renewed arrogance might provoke divine anger again. Apparently, even ancient parties carried theological risk assessments. Human beings truly can make anything stressful. Still, ordinary life keeps expanding naturally. Couples marry, farmers plant fresh crops, traders negotiate loudly beside river docks. Civilization rebuilds because rebuilding remains one of humanity's oldest instincts. You walk beside restored canals where moonlight shimmers softly across moving water. Frogs croak from nearby reeds while cool night air carries traces of roasting garlic and lamp smoke through open windows. Somewhere distant temple bells mark another completed ritual beneath Enlil's authority. The god's image changes subtly after the flood-dreaded dawn spread. He no longer appears merely as ruler of storms and kingship. Now he becomes a being capable of resetting civilization itself when balance fails. That possibility lingers beneath every prayer and political ceremony. Authority backed by annihilation feels difficult to ignore. Researchers from Harvard have noted that flood myths across many cultures often reinforce moral and social order by portraying survival as conditional rather than guaranteed. In Mesopotamia, these narratives may have strengthened respect toward divine institutions already intertwined with political power, or perhaps frightened people simply wanted explanations for terrible events. Both interpretations feel painfully human. Your mind drifts toward the lone survivor standing beneath clearing skies after endless floodwaters finally receded. Imagine the exhaustion. Imagine rebuilding language for grief large enough to describe entire worlds disappearing. Ancient storytellers understood something important here. Survival itself changes people permanently. Civilizations too. In your ears, night insects hum softly beside canal banks while temple singers begin slower evening chants echoing across the rooftops. The melodies sound calmer now than before the flood stories emerged. More reflective, less triumphant, as though humanity learned caution, yet history rarely stays humble forever. Already new kingdoms rise along the rivers. New rulers seek Enlil's blessing for expanding ambitions. New temples gather wealth and influence beneath sacred banners. Human noise grows steadily louder again across Mesopotamia, and somewhere within the old myths the storm god continues listening. The rebuilt cities shine beneath rising sunlight, while caravans move steadily across the plains carrying copper, timber, wool, and carved stone between growing kingdoms. You walk beside busy roads where dust swirls around traders speaking dozens of dialects beneath fluttering banners. Civilization has recovered from flood memories, yet peace remains temporary. Rival gods rival priesthoods, and rival rulers now compete constantly for influence across Mesopotamia. Even heaven develops politics. The scent of horse sweat and heated leather drifts through crowded streets as royal envoys arrive from distant cities bearing gifts for temples dedicated to Enlil. Yet alongside his worship rise other powerful divine figures connected with war, wisdom, fertility, moonlight, and creation itself. The divine world grows crowded, and crowded systems rarely remain harmonious forever. Inside a shaded courtyard near the Eka sanctuary, priests debate theology beside bowls of dates and watered beer, while apprentices record arguments carefully onto clay tablets. Their discussions sound polite outwardly, but tension moves beneath every phrase, because religious influence shapes political influence. If one city's patron god rises higher within the sacred hierarchy, that city often gains prestige, trade, advantages, and diplomatic power. Divine status becomes geopolitical currency. Ancient public relations operated on an impressive scale. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago confirm that Mesopotamian religion evolved continuously through shifting alliances between cities and empires. Gods absorbed attributes from one another. Local traditions blended together. Divine hierarchies changed as political power shifted across the region. Enlil remains enormously important, but his dominance never goes completely unchallenged. You pass through temple archives where shelves overflow with hymns praising various gods in dramatically competitive language. One text calls Enlil supreme ruler of heaven and earth. Another elevates a rival deity as source of wisdom greater than storms or kingship. Apparently divine marketing departments worked overtime. For a moment it feels as though the entire religious landscape vibrates with quiet rivalry. Priests defend sacred traditions passionately because their authority depends upon maintaining the prestige of specific gods and temples. Theological debates carry real consequences. A curious surviving commentary hints that certain priesthoods accused rivals of performing improper rituals or misinterpreting omens during periods of political instability. Imagine scholarly religious arguments where incorrect incense placement might theoretically threaten national security. Human beings remain wonderfully dramatic. You continue through Nippur while warm afternoon winds carry the smell of baked barley and river mud across crowded marketplaces. Nearby scribes teach young students the complicated symbols required for official record-keeping. Education itself becomes tied closely to temple systems and divine traditions. Knowledge gives power, and Enlil's priests understand that clearly. Records examined by historians from Stanford and Yale suggest literacy remained concentrated among elite administrative and religious classes throughout much of Mesopotamian history. Control over writing meant control over laws, contracts, ritual knowledge, and historical memory. In other words, whoever wrote the story often shaped reality. Inside temple chambers, priests recite ancient flood accounts portraying Enlil as overwhelming authority capable of destroying humanity itself. Those stories strengthen the god's fearful reputation even while rival traditions attempt elevating other divine figures. Persuasive. Yet another force now complicates the religious landscape further. Empires begin expanding beyond individual city-states. Conquerors absorb local gods into broader systems, rather than erasing them completely. New rulers discover practical advantages in respecting established religious traditions. Conquest works better when fewer citizens riot. You walk beside military barracks near the city walls where soldiers sharpen bronze weapons beneath striped awnings. Their commanders dedicate victories to Enlil publicly before campaigns begin. Sacred approval transforms warfare into moral necessity, or at least that is the official explanation. A preserved royal inscription describes one ruler claiming Enlil personally commanded military expansion against neighbouring territories accused of rebellion and disorder. Historians from Oxford caution that such language often justified ordinary political ambitions through divine rhetoric. Kings throughout history become remarkably creative once heaven starts endorsing taxation and invasion. Still, many ordinary citizens genuinely believe Enlil protects civilization against chaos beyond the city walls. Nomadic raiders, foreign armies, drought, disease, and rebellion all threaten fragile urban stability. The storm god's authority feels comforting precisely because the world remains dangerous. Protection and control often arrive together. As dusk approaches, temple musicians perform evening hymns beneath enormous banners, rippling against darkening skies. The melodies echo softly across canals where fishermen guide narrow boats through reflected torchlight. The atmosphere feels peaceful briefly, yet beneath that calm arguments continue among priests, rulers, and scholars regarding the true structure of divine authority. Some traditions portray Enlil as ultimate ruler above all others. Different regions elevate alternative gods depending upon local politics and cultural identity. No agreement lasts permanently. Researchers from Harvard have argued that Mesopotamian religion functioned less like a fixed system and more like an evolving network adapting continuously to social and political changes. Divine relationships shifted alongside human relationships. Even the heavens reflected earthly instability. Your mind drifts toward younger priests studying old flood myths late into the night beneath oil lamps and drifting incense smoke. They copy stories carefully because memory preserves legitimacy. If Enlil once judged humanity for excessive noise and disorder, then present rulers can claim sacred responsibility for maintaining control today. The logic serves institutions elegantly. A scandalous aside from one fragmentary text even suggests rival priesthoods occasionally exaggerated divine punishments associated with competing gods in order to attract frightened worshippers toward their own temples. Apparently, spiritual advertising has always included aggressive tactics. Some habits survive millennia unchanged. The evening wind cools gradually while stars emerge above the river plains one by one. Families gather inside courtyards for simple meals of bread, lentils, onions, and fish. Children fall asleep beside softly glowing lamps while distant temple bells mark the changing hours. Ordinary life continues beneath extraordinary beliefs. In your ears, overlapping chants from different sanctuaries drift together across the rooftops. Competing gods, competing cities, competing visions of order. Yet Enlil's presence still looms heavily above them all because few divine figures possess comparable authority over kingship storms and cosmic judgment, especially after the flood stories spread. The god who nearly erased humanity cannot easily be ignored, and as large empires prepare rising armies beside the rivers, rulers increasingly invoke Enlil's terrifying authority while seeking domination far beyond the old city-states. The next age approaches loudly, very loudly. The centuries move forward like slow river currents carrying kingdoms toward greatness and ruin in equal measure. You travel now through broader roads crowded with soldiers, tax collectors, caravan merchants, and royal messengers racing between expanding empires. The old city-states still stand beside the rivers, but their independence weakens beneath larger political forces gathering across Mesopotamia. Power wants more power, and rulers continue invoking Enlil while reaching for it. Warm desert wind blows dust against your face as enormous military columns march beside canal systems stretching toward distant horizons. Bronze spearheads glitter beneath the afternoon sun. Officers shout commands while supply carts creak beneath sacks of grain, destined for border campaigns. The empire machine never stops eating, yet every conquest still requires sacred approval. Before armies depart, priests perform elaborate ceremonies within Enlil's temples. Incense clouds rise through torchlit halls while kings kneel publicly before the storm god's authority. Offerings overflow across altars carved with lion stars and sacred symbols older than memory itself. The message remains unmistakable. Military victory equals divine favor. Defeat suggests heavenly rejection. Records studied by researchers from Princeton and Cambridge confirm that Mesopotamian emperors frequently described themselves as chosen instruments of divine will. Royal inscriptions portray conquest not as ordinary political expansion, but as sacred missions restoring cosmic order against rebellious enemies. History's public relations strategies rarely change much. You enter a vast administrative courtyard attached to one of Enlil's temple complexes where scribes record incoming tribute from conquered territories. Ivory tusks, cedar timber, gold jewelry, exotic animal skins, crates of grain. Everything catalogued carefully onto clay tablets stacked in orderly rows. Empire produces paperwork endlessly. Nearby exhausted labourers unload stone blocks destined for new monuments celebrating royal victories achieved supposedly under Enlil's guidance. Their backs ache beneath burdens, while elite officials discuss theology in shaded chambers cooled by damp-woven curtains. The contrast feels impossible to ignore. A surviving inscription from an Akkadian ruler describes Enlil granting universal kingship over foreign lands after successful campaigns. Historians from Yale note that such declarations helped unify diverse populations beneath centralized authority by linking imperial rule directly to divine order. Obey the king, the god approved him personally. Simple messaging, very effective. For a moment, it feels as though the entire empire breathes through ritual performance. Victories become sacred festivals. Taxes become offerings supporting cosmic balance. Even brutal military discipline receives spiritual justification beneath Enlil's towering reputation. Authority wraps itself in holiness. You walk through bustling market districts transformed by imperial expansion. Traders from distant regions now crowd the streets speaking unfamiliar languages while selling spices, precious stones, dyed fabrics, and crafted weapons. Foreign customs mix uneasily beside ancient traditions rooted deeply within the river cities. Civilization grows louder again. Remember. Thus that detail, the scent of roasting lamb and hot bitumen drifts across crowded intersections where musicians compete with shouting merchants and clattering wagon wheels. Somewhere nearby, temple bells ring sharply enough to interrupt conversations across the marketplace. Even commerce pauses briefly for the gods. Researchers from Stanford and the University of Chicago suggest Mesopotamian empires relied heavily upon religious symbolism to maintain cohesion across geographically diverse territories. Shared rituals and divine hierarchies helped create political identity larger than individual cities or tribes. Enlil's authority scales remarkably well for imperial administration. Yet beneath official grandeur, ordinary people experience empire differently. Farmers surrender larger harvest portions to support armies and temple systems. Craftsmen face increasing labor demands. Families worry constantly about conscription taxes, and unpredictable political changes sweeping across distant capitals, empire feels impressive from palace balconies, less impressive from muddy fields during tax season. You pass a line of workers repairing irrigation channels beneath brutal afternoon heat, while armed overseers monitor progress carefully. Nearby, an elderly farmer mutters prayers toward Enlil's temple tower rising beyond the fields. Not prayers for conquest, prayers for stable weather and healthy crops. That distinction matters. A curious legal document discovered near ancient Sippar records disputes between temple authorities and local labourers regarding work obligations during canal maintenance seasons. Apparently, even sacred infrastructure projects generated arguments about fairness and exhaustion. Human civilization remains wonderfully consistent. As evening approaches, royal officials organise a massive public ceremony celebrating military victories against neighbouring territories. Torches illuminate broad plazas packed with cheering citizens, while priests carry sacred statues through crowds thick with incense smoke and flower petals. The spectacle feels overwhelming intentionally. Drums thunder against stone walls, trumpets echo across canal waters. Soldiers parade captured weapons beneath towering banners embroidered with symbols associated with Enlil's protection. The god of storms now marches beside empire. Records confirm that some rulers dedicated entire conquered cities to Enlil, following successful campaigns framing Firmina expansion as proof that cosmic order favoured imperial authority. Yet scholars from Harvard continue debating how deeply ordinary citizens accepted these claims versus simply adapting pragmatically to changing political realities. Public enthusiasm becomes difficult to measure accurately across 4,000 years. Still, ritual shapes emotional experience powerfully. Standing among thousands beneath torchlit skies while drums shake the ground beneath your feet, you might easily believe divine forces truly guide the Empire's destiny. Especially when resistance carries dangerous consequences, your thoughts drift toward the old flood traditions while watching imperial celebrations grow increasingly extravagant. Humanity once feared Enlil might destroy civilization for becoming too noisy and ambitious. Now entire empires glorify expansion beneath his sacred name. The irony hangs quietly beneath the music. A scandalous scholarly debate continues regarding whether Mesopotamian flood myths subtly criticized imperial excess by portraying divine punishment against uncontrolled human growth and arrogance. Some historians see warnings embedded within the narratives. Others argue later interpreters impose modern concerns onto ancient stories. The debate remains unresolved, and in your ears, festival chants blend with distant canal water moving steadily through darkness beyond the city walls. Above the celebration, stars emerge slowly across enormous skies that once watched floodwaters swallow entire worlds within mythic memory. Yet humanity keeps building upward. Bigger armies, bigger temples, bigger ambitions, and always beneath the watchful authority of Enlil, the storm god, who granted kingship while carrying the terrifying memory of near annihilation. The empires believe they control destiny now. History will eventually test that confidence. The empire stretches wider with every passing generation, yet ordinary mornings still begin quietly beside the canals. You wake before sunrise in a crowded neighbourhood where smoke curls gently from clay ovens, and sleepy workers shuffle toward fields beneath fading stars. Roosters call from rooftops. Water carriers balance heavy jars across narrow alleys, somewhere nearby. A baby begins crying while exhausted parents whisper soft prayers toward Enlil before another difficult day begins. History often remembers kings, but civilizations survive through ordinary people. The scent of damp earth and barley porridge fills the cool morning air as farmers gather tools beside irrigation channels glimmering faintly beneath early light. Their hands already carry scars from years of labor. Bent backs, cracked fingernails, sunburned necks. Empire rests upon bodies like these, and Enlil watches over all of it. You follow family walking toward distant fields beyond the city walls. The father guides 2 oxen pulling a wooden plough while his older daughter carries baskets filled with seed grain. Her younger brother trails behind, sleepily rubbing dust from his eyes, while chewing flatbread still warm from the oven. Nobody here discusses cosmic theology over breakfast. They discuss weather, water levels, crop disease, tax collectors. Survival shapes daily conversation more than philosophy ever could. Records studied by researchers from Yale and Stanford confirm that Mesopotamian agriculture required constant maintenance of irrigation systems vulnerable to flood damage, drought, and neglect. Farming families depended heavily upon collective labor, coordinated through local authorities and temple institutions. One broken canal could ruin entire harvests. For a moment, it feels as though every breath within these river valleys depends upon fragile balance. Too little water destroys crops slowly. Too much water destroys them immediately. Enlil, associated with storms, wind, and authority, remains deeply connected to that uncertainty in the minds of ordinary citizens. Fear becomes practical here. You kneel beside workers clearing mud from irrigation trenches, while dragonflies skim low across shallow water. Sweat darkens rough wool clothing long before midday heat fully arrives. Nearby labourers exchange rumours about recent omens observed near the temple. A strange bird appeared during ceremony. A priest stumbled while chanting. Thunder sounded unexpectedly before dawn. Small details matter enormously in anxious societies. A preserved collection of household prayers reveals ordinary Mesopotamians often appealed directly to gods for protection against illness, crop failure, and legal troubles, rather than seeking abstract spiritual enlightenment. Religion functioned as the emotional survival equipment woven into daily routines, and honestly, given the circumstances, that feels understandable. You continue through farming districts where women grind grain between heavy stones, while children chase goats beside mud brick homes patched repeatedly after seasonal storms. The air smells of smoked onions, sweat, and drying fish hanging beside doorways. Life feels exhausting but intimate. A curious legal tablet records complaints from labourers assigned mandatory canal work during crucial planting seasons. Apparently tensions between state demands and family survival existed constantly beneath the polished language of royal inscriptions. Empires adore monuments. Workers usually prefer naps. As afternoon heat intensifies, you return toward the city where merchants crowd shaded markets selling dates, wool cloth, copper tools, and fermented beer, thick enough to resemble soup more than modern drinks. Scribes sit cross-legged beside reed baskets full of tablets offering writing services for contracts and disputes. Literacy remains specialized power. Researchers from Oxford and Columbia note that most ordinary citizens likely experienced official religion through festivals, local rituals, and public ceremonies, rather than through direct access to written theology. Priests and scribes controlled sacred texts, while common people absorbed beliefs through performance and tradition, meaning travelled by sound more than books. In your ears, temple musicians begin afternoon hymns drifting softly across the marketplace while incense smoke curls upward beside towering sanctuary walls. Citizens pause briefly during prayers, touching foreheads or murmuring requests toward Enlil and other divine powers. Not dramatic requests usually. Please keep the river calm. Please spare the children from fever. Please let grain prices remain reasonable this season. Human hopes often stay beautifully small. Yet above these ordinary lives hangs constant awareness of divine judgment. Flood myths circulate through taverns and courtyards, reminding listeners that civilization itself once nearly vanished because humanity became too chaotic and loud. Imagine hearing that story after 12 exhausting hours repairing canals. The message lands differently. Scholars from Harvard continue debating whether flood traditions encourage social obedience by portraying catastrophe as punishment for disorder. Some historians argue the narratives reinforced respect toward authority structures linked with temple institutions. Others caution against reducing complex myths into simple political tools. Ancient people believe many things sincerely, including frightening things. As evening approaches, families gather inside open courtyards cooled by damp reed mats hanging near doorways. Lamps flicker softly while lentil stew simmers beside clay ovens. Neighbours exchange gossip about taxes, marriages, illnesses, and recent temple ceremonies. Ordinary conversation fills the night air. You sit quietly beside an elderly fisherman repairing torn nets beneath moonlight reflected across slow-moving canal water. His hands move automatically through familiar motions while he speaks about Enlil with calm resignation rather than terror. The gods remain powerful. Humans remain temporary. That is simply how the world works. The simplicity feels strangely comforting. A scandalous surviving letter from one provincial official complains bitterly about corruption among certain tax administrators supposedly acting under sacred authority. Apparently divine bureaucracy occasionally attracted deeply annoying personalities. Another timeless tradition. Still, despite exhaustion and inequality, people continue finding moments of tenderness within these ancient cities. Lovers meet secretly beside riverbanks. Parents sing children to sleep beneath warm evening winds. Friends laugh over terrible jokes and watered beer after long workdays. Civilization survives through these quiet moments too. In your ears, distant temple bells mark another completed day beneath Enlil's authority, while stars shimmer across clear skies above the sleeping empire. Somewhere beyond the darkness, kings still plan wars and priests still interpret omens. But tonight you remain among ordinary people whose lives form the true heartbeat of Mesopotamia. The farmers, the bakers, the scribes, the mothers whispering prayers during storms, all living beneath the memory of a god who once tried destroying humanity and might, according to old stories, someday lose patience again. Night settles gently across the empire, while cool wind glides over rooftops and canal water reflects long ribbons of silver moonlight. You walk beside quiet temple walls where most citizens already sleep behind shuttered windows, yet, deep within sacred chambers, lamps still burn beside rows of clay tablets containing some of the most powerful ideas in Mesopotamian civilization, ideas about destiny itself. The air inside the archive feels warm and dry, thick with the smell of clay dust, cedar oil, and old smoke absorbed into wooden shelves over countless generations. Scribes bend silently above fresh tablets, while senior priests supervise with exhausting precision. One mistake matters here. A misplaced symbol could alter legal agreements, ritual instructions, or sacred histories preserved for future generations. Writing remains both practical technology and holy responsibility, especially when recording matters connected to Enlil. Your fingers brush cool clay surfaces covered with tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed carefully by reed styluses. Tax records sit beside hymns. Astronomical observations rest beside flood stories and royal decrees. The archive resembles a sleeping memory palace for the entire civilization. And somewhere within these shelves lies an even heavier concept: the tablets of destiny. According to Mesopotamian tradition, certain divine objects or decrees granted supreme authority over cosmic order itself. Different myths describe them differently, yet the central idea remains astonishingly powerful. Whoever controls destiny controls reality. Naturally, Enlil becomes closely associated with such authority. Researchers from the University of Chicago and Cambridge note that Mesopotamian religion frequently linked divine legitimacy with control over fate, kingship, and lawful order. Enlil's role as chief authority figure made him central to narratives involving cosmic governance and sacred decrees shaping human existence. In simpler terms, he becomes heaven's ultimate administrator, only with more storms and fewer meetings about office printer budgets. For a moment, it feels as though the archive walls themselves hum quietly with accumulated belief. Priests here do not merely preserve stories, they preserve structure, law, memory, identity. Without written continuity, empires fracture quickly into confusion. Writing becomes civilization's nervous system. You watch an elderly scribe instructing apprentices beside low oil lamps flickering against painted plaster walls. Their voices remain soft because sacred texts demand respect. One apprentice carefully copies a hymn praising Enlil as the god who determines the fates of rulers and nations. The language sounds absolute, no room for negotiation. A surviving ritual text describes priests invoking Enlil during important political transitions because his approval supposedly stabilized the destiny of kingdoms themselves. Crowning ceremonies, military campaigns, treaties, and major construction projects all carried spiritual implications tied to divine order. Nothing important feels fully secular here. Outside the archive, temple courtyards sleep beneath cool midnight air, while guards pace slowly beside shadowed gates. Somewhere distant, dogs bark briefly before silence returns across the city. The stillness feels fragile, because destiny, according to these traditions, can change suddenly. A flood, a drought, a failed harvest, a king collapsing unexpectedly during a ceremony. Everything depends upon forces larger than human planning. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford continue to debating how literally Mesopotamians understood divine control over fate. Some scholars argue educated elites viewed destiny symbolically through ritual and political systems. Others believe many genuinely perceived human lives as deeply shaped by supernatural decree. Perhaps ancient people balanced both ideas simultaneously. Modern humans often do the same while pretending otherwise. You continue deeper into the archive where rare tablets remain wrapped carefully into protective cloth. Senior priests alone may access certain collections connected with sacred rituals and royal legitimacy. Their guarded behavior suggests knowledge itself functions as concentrated power, and power invites secrecy. A curious surviving commentary hints that disputes occasionally erupted between priesthoods over proper interpretation of divine signs and fate decrees. Imagine intense theological arguments where both sides claim the universe officially supports their paperwork. Civilization truly adores bureaucracy, yet beneath the administrative structure lies genuine existential fear. Ordinary people living beside unpredictable rivers and shifting empires desperately want reassurance that someone controls the chaos. The idea of sacred destiny offers emotional stability against random suffering. Enlil embodies that stability, or at least the promise of it. Your mind drifts toward families sleeping across the city tonight. A pregnant mother hoping her child survives infancy. A merchant praying tomorrow's caravan arrives safely. A soldier fearing deployment orders before harvest season. All wondering quietly whether fate already waits written somewhere beyond human sight. The concept feels both comforting and terrifying. Records examined by scholars from Oxford suggest Mesopotamian divination practices reflected deep cultural investment in understanding divine intentions before important decisions occurred. Priests studied celestial movements, weather patterns, dreams and ritual signs, hoping to glimpse fragments of destiny early enough to respond appropriately. Humanity has always wanted spoilers for the future. You step onto an elevated terrace overlooking the sleeping city while cool wind stirs your clothing gently beneath enormous star-filled skies. Temple towers cast long shadows across narrow streets where oil lamps flicker faintly behind shuttered homes. The world feels suspended between certainty and uncertainty. Enlil's authority represents order yet flood myths, remind everyone that order can collapse catastrophically if divine patience ends. Destiny offers structure but not safety. That distinction matters enormously. A scandalous scholarly debate continues regarding whether the famous tablets of destiny represented literal, sacred objects within mythology or broader symbolic concepts about lawful authority and cosmic governance. Historians remain divided because surviving texts leave frustrating ambiguity. Ancient storytellers rarely explain everything neatly, perhaps wisely. Mystery strengthens power. In your ears, distant temple singers begin low nighttime chants drifting across rooftops like slow-moving wind through reeds. Their melodies praise Enlil as guardian of kingship, giver of decrees and master of heavenly judgment. The titles sound majestic. Yet you remember the flood stories too. The same authority determining civilization's fate once chose near annihilation instead. That contradiction lingers beneath every hymn and ritual. Humanity craves order from powers capable of destruction, And somewhere inside these shadowed archives, scribes continue preserving the terrifying possibility that destiny itself may rest within hands far beyond human control. The seasons turn slowly across Mesopotamia, while heat settles heavier upon the river plains. You walk through fields where cracked earth spreads between struggling crops beneath a pale and merciless sky. Farmers stare upward anxiously each morning, searching for clouds that refuse to appear. Irrigation channels shrink gradually into muddy ribbons while cattle grow thinner beside dusty reeds. The land feels thirsty, and thirsty land frightens civilizations. Warm wind carries the smell of dry soil and distant smoke across exhausted villages where people speak in quieter voices than usual. Temple offerings increase, public prayers grow longer. Every unusual weather pattern becomes a possible warning from Enlil. Because when nature controls survival, weather becomes theology immediately. You pass through a crowded marketplace strangely subdued despite the usual chaos of trade. Merchants complain about rising grain prices. Mothers ration bread carefully between children. Scribes record emergency distributions from temple storage houses, while guards monitor increasingly tense crowds. Hunger changes social moods quickly. A preserved administrative record confirms certain Mesopotamian cities experienced severe food shortages during periods of environmental instability. Researchers from Yale and Princeton note that drought, salinization of farmland, and shifting river patterns periodically weakened agricultural systems across the region. In simple terms, civilization remained vulnerable constantly. For a moment, it feels as though the sky itself presses downward upon the cities. The old flood fears never disappeared completely, yet drought introduces different anxieties. Too much water destroys suddenly, too little water destroys patiently. Both feel like judgment. Inside Enlil's temples, priests organize larger ceremonies meant to calm divine anger and restore cosmic balance. Incense smoke thickens the air, while musicians repeat slow hypnotic rhythms through crowded sanctuaries illuminated by flickering oil lamps. The atmosphere grows intense. Citizens kneel shoulder to shoulder beneath painted ceilings, while priests recite hymns describing Enlil as Lord of wind storms and agricultural fertility. Offerings pile higher upon altars each week. More grain, more animals, more desperate promise. A curious surviving tablet describes citizens interpreting unusual celestial events as warnings connected with coming famine. Eclipses, strange star patterns, and sudden storms all carried symbolic significance within Mesopotamian religious thought. Ancient people basically lived inside an ongoing cosmic group chat, except every message might predict catastrophe. Researchers from Stanford and Oxford suggest environmental unpredictability strongly shaped Mesopotamian concepts of divine authority. Gods like Enlil represented not only spiritual forces, but also humanity's attempt to explain unstable natural systems capable of overwhelming even advanced societies. Fear creates meaning rapidly. You continue through farming districts where families now work longer hours maintaining irrigation channels under brutal sunlight. Children haul water buckets almost larger than themselves. Elderly workers scrape salt crust from damaged soil, hoping crops might still survive another season. The labor feels endless. Yet people continue praying. A woman hangs small protective charms beside her doorway, while murmuring appeals toward Enlil for rain. Nearby fishermen argue nervously about falling river levels beside boats resting awkwardly against muddy banks. Nobody trusts the future right now. A surviving hymn from a drought period portrays Enlil withholding fertility from the land because human behavior disrupted sacred order. Historians from Harvard caution that such texts may reflect both genuine religious belief and political attempts to encourage social discipline during crisis. Disaster or beggars invite its competing explanation. Human failure, divine anger, environmental cycles, corrupt leadership, usually some combination of all four. As evening approaches, the heat finally weakens slightly, while red dust drifts through narrow streets. Crowded with worried citizens, Temple bells ring repeatedly, summoning public ceremonies unlike ordinary daily rituals. These gatherings feel heavier, more urgent. You join crowds moving towards the sanctuary, where priests wearing elaborate ceremonial robes carry sacred objects through torch-lit courtyards thick with smoke from burning cedar and herbs. Musicians beat drums slowly enough to resemble heartbeats echoing against stone walls. The entire city seems to breathe together. Records studied by researchers from Colombia indicate Mesopotamian communities often responded to environmental stress through expanded ritual activity involving processions, sacrifices, and public acts of devotion meant to restore harmony between gods and humanity. Religion becomes crisis management, emotional and political simultaneously. Inside the sanctuary, priests chant prayers asking Enlil to release life-giving winds and spare the people from famine. Citizens bow their heads while children cling sleepily to exhausted parents beneath rising heat trapped inside crowded chambers. For a moment, it feels as though hope itself depends upon invisible forces listening somewhere above the temple roof. A scandalous surviving letter from one provincial governor complains bitterly that local priests demanded excessive offerings during food shortages while ordinary workers struggled to survive. Apparently, even sacred emergencies occasionally attracted opportunists. Human nature remains remarkably durable. Still, many ceremonies likely offer genuine comfort. Shared ritual creates emotional solidarity during frightening times. When harvests fail and uncertainty spreads, gathering beside neighbors beneath familiar prayers may help people endure psychologically. Sometimes meaning matters almost as much as food. Scholars continue debating whether ancient Mesopotamian societies viewed disasters primarily as punishment for moral failure or simply inevitable aspects of existence requiring ritual response. Arguments split because surviving evidence supports both interpretations depending upon the specific text and historical moment. Ancient beliefs rarely fit neat categories. Your mind drifts toward the flood myths again while standing beneath dry evening skies. Enlil once unleashed overwhelming water against humanity according to the stories. Now citizens fear he may withhold water instead. Either extreme threaten civilization. That realization must have haunted these river societies constantly. In your ears, nighttime chants rise softly across the city while families eat smaller meals beneath dim oil lamps. Outside, the wind remains hot and dry against canal banks where frogs once croaked loudly after seasonal rains. Silence spreads differently during drought, less dramatic than floods, more patient, more exhausting, and beneath that silence lingers the ancient suspicion that Enlil, god of storms and judgment, still measures humanity carefully. Through every changing season, every failed harvest, every frightened prayer whispered toward empty skies. The drought finally breaks with violent storms that sweep across Mesopotamia beneath skies glowing strange shades of green and bronze. Rain lashes temple roofs through the night, while thunder rolls endlessly above the river plains. You stand beneath a covered passageway, watching priests hurry between sanctuary chambers carrying bowls of oil, bundles of herbs, and sacred instruments wrapped carefully against the weather. The rituals tonight feel different, more secretive, more urgent. The scent of myrrh, cedar smoke, and wet wool fills the air as temple attendants close heavy wooden doors separating inner ceremonial rooms from ordinary worshippers outside. Guards remain posted silently beside torchlit corridors, while senior priests prepare rites believed powerful enough to calm divine anger itself. Because when Enlil grows restless, entire civilizations tremble. You follow faint drum beats deeper into the sanctuary where shadows flicker against painted walls covered with stars, lions, and swirling wind patterns. Low chants echo through narrow chambers illuminated only by oil lamps floating atop shallow bronze bowls. The atmosphere feels dreamlike, almost underwater. A preserved ritual tablet describes ceremonies performed during periods of political instability or environmental crisis involving purification rites, sacred music, incense offerings, and repeated invocations seeking divine mercy. Researchers from Yale and the University of Chicago note that Mesopotamian temples often combine psychological reassurance with highly structured symbolic performances during uncertain times. Ancient therapy arrived wrapped in smoke and chanting. For a moment, it feels as though the boundaries between religion, theatre, and government disappear completely inside these chambers. Priests move with rehearsed precision because every gesture carries meaning. Every sound matters. A bell rings softly once, then silence. The high priest steps forward wearing layered robes embroidered with symbols associated with Enlil's authority over storms and fate. Assistants scatter crushed herbs across heated stones, releasing sharp fragrances that drift slowly through the room. The smell clings to your throat. Nearby musicians begin low-repeating melodies played upon lyres and drums tuned deliberately to calming rhythms. Their music does not entertain, it transforms atmosphere. Outside, thunder answers faintly across the darkened city. Researchers from Stanford suggest ritual repetition within ancient religious ceremonies likely produced powerful emotional effects among participants, especially during collective stress. Rhythmic chanting, synchronized movement, and sensory immersion can alter perception remarkably, even in modern settings. Human brains respond deeply to ceremony, especially frightened brains. You watch priests pour beer milk, oil, and honey before sacred altars while reciting ancient hymns asking Enlil to restore harmony between heaven and earth. The language emphasizes balance repeatedly. Too much noise disrupts balance. Dissystems. Too much pride disrupts balance. Too much disorder invites catastrophe. The flood stories linger beneath every phrase. A curious surviving commentary hints that some rituals involved symbolic reenactments of cosmic conflict between order and chaos. Participants may have believed proper ceremonies literally strengthened civilization against destructive forces threatening society from within and beyond the city walls. Imagine carrying responsibility for the universe during your night shift. The pressure seems exhausting, yet the emotional intensity feels genuine. These priests do not appear careless or cynical tonight. Their concentration carries the heavy seriousness of people convinced ritual failure might endanger thousands of lives. And perhaps belief itself grants ceremonies their power. You continue through interconnected chambers where scribes quietly record ritual sequences onto fresh clay tablets. Future generations must know exactly how these rites were performed during difficult years. Memory preserves survival. A surviving temple inventory confirms sanctuaries dedicated enormous resources towards ceremonial materials, including imported woods, perfumes, precious metals, fabrics, and musical instruments. Researchers from Harvard argue such investments reflected the central role ritual played within Mesopotamian political and spiritual life. Empires funded incense with astonishing enthusiasm. Outside the sanctuary, citizens gather beneath covered courtyards, listening anxiously to distant chants drifting through stone walls. Mothers hold sleeping children wrapped against cool storm air while elderly men whisper prayers beneath their breath. Nobody fully understands what happens inside the inner chambers. That mystery infuses the emotional effect. A scandalous aside from one fragmented text even suggests rival priesthoods occasionally accused one another of performing ineffective rituals after disasters continued despite extensive ceremonies. Apparently, theological blame games existed long before modern social media. Some human instincts truly never fade. Still, many people likely experienced genuine comfort simply knowing sacred experts actively addressed communal fears. During plague, drought, or political instability, visible ritual action reassures populations that someone remains in control. Even symbolic control matters psychologically. Scholars from Oxford continued debating whether Mesopotamian ritual specialists viewed ceremonies as literally influencing divine behavior, or primarily maintaining social cohesion through symbolic performance. The surviving evidence supports multiple interpretations simultaneously. Ancient religion resists easy simplification. Your mind drifts toward Enlil himself while chants deepen through the sanctuary halls. The god appears increasingly complex across these traditions. Stormbringer, kingmaker, destroyer of civilizations, guardian of cosmic order, source of fertile winds, punisher of excess. Contradictions gather around powerful beings naturally, especially beings imagined across thousands of years. The rain outside softens gradually into gentle tapping against stone roofs, while priests conclude final invocations beside glowing altar fires. Their voices lower almost into whispers now, as though speaking directly into the darkness. In your ears, the last notes of ceremonial music linger softly through smoke-filled chambers, while attendants extinguish several lamps one by one. Citizens waiting outside begin returning home slowly beneath wet streets reflecting torchlight, like pools of molten gold. The city exhales carefully. Another ritual completed, another night survived beneath Enlil's authority. Yet despite endless ceremonies, prayers and offerings, uncertainty never disappears entirely from Mesopotamian life. Floods still come, crops still fail, kings still wage wars, children still grow sick unexpectedly. Ritual offers structure, not guarantees, and somewhere beyond the temple walls, larger historical forces already prepare, transforming the ancient world again through invasion, migration, and shifting empires that will challenge even Enlil's long-established dominance. The winds of change are already moving, quietly, relentlessly. The generations pass like drifting smoke above the river valleys, and new armies begin appearing along the horizons of Mesopotamia. You stand atop weathered city walls, watching foreign banners ripple beside advancing columns of soldiers moving through dust-coloured twilight. Different languages echo across the plains now, different weapons, different kings carrying unfamiliar gods into ancient lands already crowded with sacred traditions. History rarely pauses politely. The scent of horse sweat leather and campfire smoke spreads through nervous cities preparing for uncertain futures. Merchants close market stalls early. Temple officials whisper urgently inside archive rooms. Ordinary families gather belongings quietly in case violence reaches the streets before dawn. Yet conquest in Mesopotamia rarely destroys everything immediately. Or often it absorbs. New rulers quickly discover these ancient cities possess enormous cultural gravity. The temples command wealth, literacy, labor systems, and emotional loyalty accumulated across centuries. Ignoring such institutions would be politically foolish. So conquerors adapt instead. Researchers from Cambridge and Columbia note that successive Mesopotamian empires often incorporated older religious systems rather than erasing them entirely. Gods changed names, merged identities, or shifted positions within evolving divine hierarchies as political power moved between cultures. Enlil survives through adaptation. You walk through crowded streets where foreign soldiers purchase bread and beer, beside local citizens speaking cautiously beneath hanging oil lamps. Tension remains visible everywhere, yet daily life resumes surprisingly quickly after occupation. Civilization prefers continuity when possible. Inside the Ekur sanctuary, priests continue rituals beneath towering ceilings blackened by generations of incense smoke. Their chants sound older than the latest conquerors and perhaps older than memory itself. That endurance carries power. For a moment it feels as though the temple exists outside ordinary time. Kings arrive, kings disappear, armies burn cities and rebuild them again. Yet the rituals continue through every political transformation. A preserved inscription from a later ruler describes restoring Enlil's sanctuary specifically to legitimize foreign authority over conquered populations. Historians from Yale argue such acts demonstrated respect toward deeply rooted local traditions, while simultaneously claiming inheritance of sacred kingship. Conquerors love ancient legitimacy almost as much as gold. You pass scribes copying older flood myths onto fresh tablets using updated dialects and changing political references. The stories survive because they remain emotionally useful. Floods still happen, storms still terrify people, human arrogance still invites suspicion, and Enlil still represents overwhelming authority capable of judgment. Yet rival divine figures continue rising across the broader Near East. Some gain greater prominence within imperial capitals far from traditional Mesopotamian centers. Younger priesthoods promote alternative gods associated with war wisdom or universal creation. The sacred hierarchy shifts gradually. A curious surviving commentary even complains bitterly that newer generations neglect proper respect toward ancient storm traditions in favour of fashionable foreign cults. Apparently, every era includes elders convinced civilization is declining spiritually. Humanity truly specializes in nostalgic anxiety. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford continue debating how ordinary Mesopotamians responded emotionally to changing religious landscapes during imperial transitions. Some scholars emphasize cultural blending and adaptation. Others suggest periods of significant tension between local traditions and imported political systems. Both outcomes likely occurred simultaneously. Empires rarely produce simple experience. You wander through neighborhoods transformed by international trade routes linking distant kingdoms together. Exotic spices, perfume, crowded markets. Foreign musicians perform unfamiliar melodies beside canal bridges. Travelers bring stories about mountains, deserts, and seas far beyond the old river cities. Mesopotamia becomes part of something larger. Yet enlargement also weakens older certainties. The flood myths once tied closely to local rivers now circulate across vast territories among people with different landscapes and spiritual assumptions. Enlil's image stretches across cultures until some details blur, while others become exaggerated. The god evolves through retelling. A surviving theological text portrays Enlil less as direct destroyer and more as guardian of cosmic structure delegated within broader divine systems emerging under later empires. Scholars from Oxford suggest this reflects attempts to reconcile older Mesopotamian traditions with changing political realities and religious philosophies. Even gods must navigate administrative restructuring eventually. As evening falls, temple fires glow warmly against darkening skies, while foreign officials attend ceremonies beside local elites dressed in layered wool robes embroidered with gold thread. The ritual choreography feels carefully balanced. Respect tradition, display authority, avoid rebellion. Politics again hides inside sacred performance. Outside the sanctuary walls, ordinary workers continue rebuilding roads damaged during recent military campaigns. Children play beside half-collapsed buildings while elderly citizens trade stories about earlier rulers already fading into memory. Life adapts faster than monuments. A scandalous fragment from one letter accuses certain temple officials of cooperating too enthusiastically with occupying authorities in exchange for preserved privileges and tax exemptions. Apparently, survival strategies among elites sometimes resembled opportunism rather than heroic resistance. History rarely offers mythically noble behavior. Still, many priests probably believed sincerely that preserving rituals mattered more than political loyalty to any single ruler. If ceremonies stopped completely, cultural memory itself might fracture, and memory remains sacred here. Researchers from Princeton note that Mesopotamian religious traditions survived repeated conquests partly because temple systems preserved enormous archives containing myths, laws, astronomical records, and ritual knowledge accumulated across centuries. Writing protects civilizations against forgetting. Your thoughts drift toward the ancient flood survivor stepping from his boat beneath cleared skies after divine destruction nearly erased humanity. That story already feels ancient even within these later empires. Yet people still copy it carefully. Why? Because the fear beneath it never disappears completely. Floods change into invasions. Storms change into political collapse. But human vulnerability remains constant. In your ears, evening prayers rise softly through the city while distant soldiers laugh around campfires beyond the walls. Different empires now rule these lands, yet Enlil's shadow still lingers across temple stones worn smooth by countless generations of fearful hands. The old god grows quieter, perhaps, less dominant, less absolute, but not forgotten. Not yet. Centuries drift onward, and the once mighty temples of Mesopotamia begin aging beneath layers of dust, repair, abandonment, and memory. You walk through quieter streets now where certain sanctuaries still glow with ritual fire, while others stand partially empty beneath nesting birds and cracked stonework. The world changes slowly. Then all at once, empires rise and collapse above these river plains like storms rolling across distant horizons. Languages shift, trade routes move. New philosophies spread between cities once ruled entirely through ancient divine authority. Yet Enlil does not disappear completely. Instead, he becomes a question. Inside a dim archive chamber smelling of old papyrus smoke residue and damp clay, scholars gather around worn tablets copied and recopied across generations. Their robes brush softly against stone floors, while oil lamps flicker beside stacks of fragile records preserving the old stories. The flood, the storms, the sacred decrees, the destruction of humanity, the debate. Debates begin quietly. What exactly did Enlil represent? A literal god controlling wind and kingship, a symbol of political authority, a reflection of environmental fear, an attempt to explain why civilization feels permanently unstable. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard note that even ancient interpreters sometimes disagreed about divine meaning within Mesopotamian traditions. Different cities emphasize different aspects of Enlil's character, depending upon political circumstances, theological priorities, and local ritual customs. Interpretation started early. Human beings rarely stop arguing once stories survive long enough. You sit beside elderly scribes discussing old flood narratives beneath drifting incense smoke. One insists Enlil punished humanity because moral order collapsed through arrogance and excess. Another argues the myths preserve distorted memories of catastrophic natural disasters later reshaped into theology. Neither sounds entirely wrong. For a moment, it feels as though the room itself contains centuries layered together like dust upon forgotten shelves. Every generation inherits the same stories, yet hears them differently depending upon present fears. A kingdom facing invasion hears warnings about disorder. A farming community facing drought hears lessons about nature's power. Priests hear sacred truth. Politicians hear useful symbolism. A curious surviving commentary even complains that younger scholars increasingly treat ancient flood accounts as philosophical allegories rather than literal divine history. Apparently, intellectual debates about symbolism versus factual belief existed long before modern universities. Some arguments truly never retire. Researchers from Stanford and Yale continue examining how Mesopotamian myths evolved through reinterpretation across different historical periods. Certain later texts soften Enlil's destructive qualities while emphasizing cosmic governance and lawful order instead. Perhaps civilizations gradually grow uncomfortable worshipping gods who nearly erased humanity. Or perhaps memories simply soften over time. You wander through partially abandoned temple corridors where faded murals still depict storms, sacred mountains, and divine assemblies deciding human fate. Dust settles gently upon carved reliefs worn smooth by centuries of touching hands. The silence feels heavy here. Once these halls overflowed with chanting priests, royal processions, and frightened citizens carrying offerings during floods and droughts. Now only scattered caretakers remain maintaining fragments of older traditions. Civilization forgets slowly. A preserved academic's tablet from a later scholarly centre analyses older flood myths, almost like literature comparing versions and discussing contradictions between traditions. Historians from Columbia suggest this reflects increasing intellectual curiosity about ancient texts beyond purely ritual use. People begin studying myths rather than simply living inside them. That transition changes everything. Outside evening wind stirs dry grass beside crumbling canal walls, while distant villages continue ordinary routines beneath darkening skies. Farmers still worry about harvests, parents still pray during storms. Human anxiety survives even when religions evolve. The emotional foundations remain familiar. Scholars from Princeton argue flood myths endure across cultures because they express universal fears regarding chaos, mortality, and forces beyond human control. Mesopotamian traditions surrounding Enlil may represent one of humanity's earliest surviving attempts to frame catastrophe within moral and cosmic narratives. Stories organize fear, Without stories, disaster feels random, and randomness terrifies the human mind deeply. You pass through a library courtyard where younger students debate whether Enlil's authority reflected actual divine experience or sophisticated political structures supporting centralized power within early urban civilization. The conversation grows animated quickly. One student gestures toward administrative records proving temples controlled enormous economic resources. Another points toward personal prayers revealing genuine emotional devotion among ordinary citizens. The debate remains unresolved, likely forever. A scandalous surviving fragment accuses certain intellectuals of disrespecting sacred tradition by treating ancient flood accounts as exaggerated folklore invented by ambitious priesthoods. Apparently, skepticism has always annoyed religious authorities immensely. Another timeless pattern. Yet even skeptics continue preserving the stories. That detail matters enormously. People rarely spend centuries copying myths they consider meaningless. Something within Enlil's narratives continues resonating. Perhaps it is the terrifying idea that civilizations can collapse suddenly despite apparent strength. Perhaps it is the image of humanity becoming too noisy, proud, or destructive for its own survival. Or perhaps the stories simply understand power too well. Power creates order. Power demands obedience. Power grows frightened by disorder. And sometimes power destroys what it once protected. In your ears, evening bells echo faintly across old temple districts, while stars emerge above broken rooftops and abandoned courtyards. The ancient storm god now lives increasingly through texts, memories, and scholarly interpretation rather than unquestioned public certainty. Yet his shadow remains enormous. The flood myths still circulate. The warnings still linger. And somewhere among these aging libraries and fading rituals, future generations quietly prepare rediscovering Enlil again through ruins buried beneath sand and silence for thousands of years to come. The centuries pass into silence. Rivers shift course slowly across forgotten plains, while entire cities disappear beneath drifting sand, collapsed brick, and stubborn weeds growing through abandoned courtyards. You walk now through landscapes where Enlil's temples once dominated the horizon, yet only broken mounds remain beneath endless sky. Civilization has gone quiet here, very quiet. The wind carries dry dust across ruined canals where fishermen once argued beside crowded docks. Cracked tablets sleep beneath buried walls. Statues lie shattered among roots and stones. Even the names of mighty kings fade gradually from human memory. Time dismantles empires patiently. For a moment, it feels as though the world itself has forgotten Mesopotamia entirely. Shepherds guide flocks across ancient foundations without realizing they walk above libraries, sanctuaries, and royal archives that once shaped human history. Yet memory rarely disappears completely. It waits. Researchers from Oxford and the University of Chicago confirm that many major Mesopotamian cities remained buried for centuries before systematic archaeological exploration began uncovering them during the 19th century. Sites associated with ancient Sumerian civilization often appeared outwardly as little more than strange hills rising from the plains, history hiding in plain sight. You stand beside one such mound beneath scorching afternoon sunlight while early archaeologists organize excavation tools nearby. Sweat darkens their clothing as workers remove layers of compacted earth basket by basket. The labor feels almost ceremonial. Brush away. Dust. Reveal fragments. Piece together forgotten worlds. A curious journal entry from an early excavation describes the emotional shock of uncovering cuneiform tablets untouched since antiquity. Imagine holding written words sleeping underground for thousands of years, while entire modern nations rose and fell above them. The sensation must have felt unreal. Researchers from Harvard note that deciphering cuneiform transformed understanding of ancient history dramatically. Before these discoveries, many Mesopotamian myths survived only indirectly through later cultural traditions. Suddenly, scholars encountered original flood stories, hymns, royal inscriptions, and administrative records in astonishing detail. Enlil emerged from the dust again, You kneel beside newly uncovered tablets while translators carefully compare symbols beneath shaded tents, smelling of parchment sweat and hot clay. The wedge-shaped writing initially appears incomprehensible, yet patterns slowly reveal themselves through years of patient scholarship. Names return first. Cities, kings, gods. Then entire narratives awaken. Flood myths, temple hymns, accounts of storms and sacred authority. The ancient voice of Mesopotamia begins speaking again after millennia of silence. A preserved excavation report describes archaeologists realizing certain flood narratives resemble traditions surviving in later religious literature across the Near East. Historians from Cambridge argue these discoveries reshaped global conversations about mythology, cultural transmission, and humanity's oldest surviving written stories. The implications felt enormous. Suddenly, Enlil was no longer merely a forgotten local deity buried beneath ruined temples. He became part of a much larger human story concerning civilization catastrophe and memory itself. You walk through partially excavated ruins where broken staircases lead toward collapsed ceremonial platforms once crowded with priests and kings. Evening light stretches long shadows across exposed brickwork, while distant workers brush dirt from carved fragments depicting divine symbols and storm imagery. The atmosphere feels strangely intimate, as though the ancient world waits patiently beneath every remaining layer of soil. Researchers from Yale and Stanford continue debating how accurately archaeological evidence reflects everyday religious experience versus elite institutional activity. Monumental temples survive more easily than ordinary homes, creating challenges when reconstructing the emotional lives of common people. Ruins preserve power unevenly. A scandalous early theory even suggested certain Mesopotamian flood accounts described literal global destruction confirmed through archaeology. Later research complicated those conclusions significantly, revealing more regional environmental evidence rather than worldwide catastrophe. Humanity apparently loves dramatic headlines across every century. Still, geological studies discussed by researchers from Colombia indicate severe flooding events absolutely shaped portions of Mesopotamian history. River systems periodically devastated settlements, reinforcing the emotional plausibility of flood traditions surrounding Enlil and divine judgment. The myths emerge from real vulnerability that matters deeply. You step inside a reconstructed archive chamber, where recovered tablets rest carefully upon padded shelves beneath controlled lighting. Translators whisper softly while tracing damaged inscriptions with delicate tools and endless concentration. One missing symbol can alter interpretation entirely. Imagine rebuilding an entire civilization through broken sentences and scattered fragments. The patience required feels almost sacred. Your thoughts drift toward the ancient scribes who originally pressed these symbols into wet clay beneath oil lamps thousands of years earlier. Did they imagine future civilizations studying their words with microscopes and academic conferences? Probably not. Yet here you are, listening again. Researchers from Princeton suggest the rediscovery of Mesopotamian literature transformed modern understanding of early urban civilization, revealing sophisticated legal systems, philosophical questions, scientific observations, and complex religious traditions far older than many previously imagined. The ancient world suddenly became more human, not silent ruins, living voices, anxious farmers, ambitious priests performing midnight rituals beneath storm clouds, families fearing Enlil's judgment during floods. The emotional distance shrinks unexpectedly. In your ears, desert wind whistles softly across excavation trenches, while evening settles over the ancient plains. Flood myths copied across countless generations now rest beneath museum glass and scholarly analysis. Yet they still carry emotional weight, because buried beneath academic debates and archaeological reports lies the same ancient fear. Civilization feels fragile. Nature remains powerful. Human ambition grows dangerously loud sometimes, and somewhere within the oldest surviving stories on Earth waits the memory of a storm god who once decided humanity itself had become too much to tolerate. The sands preserve that warning carefully. Now the modern world hears it again. The modern world hums with engines, glowing screens, and restless cities that never truly sleep yet. Ancient Mesopotamia still whispers beneath scientific research laboratories and university archives. You sit now inside a quiet, climate-controlled reading room, where historians, archaeologists, and environmental scientists examine fragments of Enlil's world beneath soft electric light. The atmosphere feels calm, almost reverent. Outside, modern traffic murmurs through distant streets. Inside, scholars lean carefully over tablets older than nearly every surviving institution on Earth. Tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay thousands of years ago still provoke arguments, wonder, and uneasy reflection. Especially the flood stories. Researchers from Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford now combine archaeology with climate science, geological surveys, and satellite mapping to understand how environmental instability shaped ancient Mesopotamian civilization. River patterns shifted unpredictably for centuries. Severe flooding events occurred repeatedly. Drought cycles disrupted agriculture and weakened political systems. The science grows increasingly detailed, yet the emotional core remains familiar. Human beings feared losing everything. For a moment, it feels as though ancient anxiety stretches invisibly across time into the present world. Modern researchers examine sediment layers and flood deposits using technologies unimaginable to the original storytellers, yet they still encounter the same essential truth. Civilization survives precariously beside powerful natural forces. A study discussed by researchers from Colombia identified evidence for major flooding episodes affecting parts of southern Mesopotamia during periods connected broadly with the early urban development. These events likely inspired collective memories later transformed into mythic narratives involving divine judgment and survival. Not literal world destruction, but devastating enough locally to feel world-ending. You watch scientists compare ancient flood accounts with environmental data projected across digital maps glowing softly against darkened walls. River channels appear and disappear over centuries. Settlements rise, collapse, and relocate according to changing water systems. Nature writes history constantly. The old stories about Enlil destroying humanity through floodwaters suddenly feel less distant when viewed beside evidence of real environmental catastrophe shaping vulnerable societies. Researchers from Yale note that myths often preserve emotional truths even when symbolic elements become exaggerated through generations of retelling. Ancient Mesopotamians may not have recorded disasters scientifically, but they documented fear, grief, instability, and survival with remarkable emotional accuracy. Stories remember feelings better than statistics. You continue through museum galleries where reconstructed tablets display translations describing humanity becoming too noisy for the gods. Nearby visitors pause thoughtfully beneath exhibits explaining ancient irrigation systems, climate stress, and urban overcrowding. The parallels feel uncomfortable sometimes. Modern cities also struggle with resource pressure, environmental uncertainty, and growing populations. Ancient flood myths suddenly stop feeling entirely ancient. A curious debate among researchers from Princeton and Cambridge centers upon whether Mesopotamian stories about divine punishment reflected practical awareness that civilizations can destabilize themselves through environmental mismanagement and unchecked expansion. Arguments remain divided. Some scholars caution against projecting modern ecological concerns backward onto ancient texts. Others believe the myths genuinely preserve early reflections on fragile relationships between humanity and nature. Either way, the stories still resonate. You sit quietly beside a reconstructed temple model, while recordings of ancient instruments play softly through hidden speakers. The music drifts through the gallery, almost like distant wind, moving across empty plains. Enlil begins feeling strangely symbolic here, not merely a storm god, a personification of overwhelming systems beyond human control. Climate, authority, nature, empire, fate itself. Researchers from the University of Chicago argue that Mesopotamian religion helped early urban societies process collective anxiety regarding unpredictable environmental conditions and political instability. Divine narratives transformed chaos into understandable stories with structure and meaning. Humans survive psychologically through narrative. Without stories, fear expands shapelessly. A scandalous modern interpretation even suggests Enlil resembles humanity's own destructive tendencies projected outward onto divine authority. According to this theory, the god who destroys civilization for excessive noise reflects ancient awareness that societies often generate conditions threatening their own survival. Some historians love bold interpretations immensely, others absolutely hate them. The debates continue endlessly across conferences, articles, and late-night university conversations fueled by terrible coffee and professional stubbornness. Yet despite disagreements, scholars broadly agree on one remarkable fact. Mesopotamian flood traditions represent some of humanity's oldest surviving literary reflections on catastrophe and survival. That alone feels extraordinary. You imagine the original storytellers sitting beside oil lamps thousands of years ago, while storms rattled shutters outside. They could not predict satellites, climate models, or modern archaeology. Yet they understood vulnerability intimately. They knew cities collapse. They knew rivers overwhelm human plans. They knew power sometimes turns destructive. Those insights remain painfully current. In your ears, soft museum ventilation hums gently, while visitors move quietly between exhibits displaying broken statues, carved seals, and weathered tablets, once buried beneath sand for centuries. The ancient world no longer feels sorrow. Researchers from Harvard continue studying how myths surrounding Enlil and other Mesopotamian gods influenced later religious and literary traditions across the Near East. Flood narratives evolved, adapted, and survived through countless retellings long after the original temples disappeared. Stories outlive empires remarkably well. Your thoughts drift toward the ordinary people behind those stories again. Farmers repairing canals beneath brutal heat, priests chanting during storms, families praying for surviving harvests while floodwaters rose outside city walls. Their fears were real. Their world felt unstable. And so they imagined a god powerful enough to explain instability itself. Perhaps that remains the lasting significance of Enlil. Not proof of literal divine wrath, but evidence that humanity has always searched desperately for meaning when confronting forces larger than individual control. Storms, floods, empires, history. The names change across centuries. The anxiety rarely does. As evening settles beyond the museum windows, reflections shimmer softly across protective glass cases holding tablets copied by ancient hands. The words remain fragile yet astonishingly durable. A god once feared across mighty river kingdoms now survives through scholarship memory and quiet reflection beneath modern electric light, still whispering, still warning, still asking uncomfortable questions about civilization and its limits. Night spreads softly across the modern world, while distant city lights shimmer like scattered embers beneath enormous skies. You sit quietly now with the long history of Enlil lingering in your thoughts, from the first river cities to the buried ruins uncovered by archaeologists thousands of years later. And a strange question remains. Why did humanity imagine gods like this at all? Why create beings capable of destroying entire civilizations for noise disorder or human ambition? The question drifts beside you like slow-moving smoke. Warm air carries the faint scent of rain through an open window, while somewhere far away traffic hums steadily across sleeping streets. The modern world feels safer than ancient Mesopotamia in many ways. Flood barriers exist. Satellites monitor storms. Governments track harvests and disease patterns. Yet anxiety never disappears completely. Researchers from Yale and Stanford suggest harsh divine figures often emerge within societies facing unstable environmental and political conditions. Early Mesopotamian civilization depended upon fragile irrigation systems, vulnerable to flood, drought, invasion, and internal conflict. Life felt uncertain constantly. In such conditions, powerful gods offered explanation and structure. If disaster strikes randomly, fear becomes unbearable. If disaster reflects divine judgment, at least suffering gains meaning. That distinction matters psychologically. For a moment, it feels as though you can understand the ancient mind more clearly now. Imagine waking each morning unsure whether rivers might destroy crops, whether kings might demand soldiers, whether disease might spread through crowded streets before winter ends. Control would feel precious. Even imagined control. A preserved scholarly commentary from the ancient world describes Enlil not merely as destroyer, but as guardian against chaos itself. The flood myths therefore carry dual meaning. Humanity fears divine punishment, yet humanity also fears a universe without order or authority entirely. Chaos terrifies civilizations deeply. Researchers from Harvard argue many ancient religions balanced fear and protection deliberately. Gods capable of punishment also provided stability, fertility law, and identity. Enlil destroys within certain stories, but he also grants kingship, organizes civilization, and sustains agricultural life. Power appears dangerous because ancient people understood danger intimately. Modern audiences sometimes expect comforting spirituality detached from hardship. Mesopotamian religion rarely offers that luxury. Their world remained too unstable for purely gentle gods. Storms were not gentle. Floods were not gentle. Empires were definitely not gentle. You walk mentally beside ancient canals again where farmers repaired embankments beneath brutal heat while priests interpreted thunder as sacred warning. Their beliefs emerged from lived experience rather than abstract philosophy. That emotional realism gives the stories lasting weight. A curious modern debate among researchers from Oxford and Princeton asks whether flood myths like Enlil's reveal early human awareness that civilizations can collapse through their own excesses. Population growth strains resources. Noise increases. Political systems expand aggressively. Eventually balance fails. The symbolism feels surprisingly contemporary. Some scholars reject that interpretation as overly modern arguing. Ancient storytellers focus primarily upon divine authority and ritual morality rather than ecological collapse. Yet the debate itself reveals how adaptable these old myths remain. Every generation hears different warnings inside them. You remember the flood survivor drifting across endless waters while civilization disappeared behind storm clouds. The image survives because it touches something timeless within human imagination, the fear of starting over. The fear that everything familiar could vanish suddenly, the hope that survival remains possible anyway. Researchers from Columbia note that catastrophe stories often serve social purposes beyond simple entertainment. They preserve memory of past dangers while reinforcing behaviors communities believe necessary for survival. Respect authority. Maintain balance. Do not grow reckless. Whether those lessons emerge through religion, politics, or environmental awareness depends upon the culture telling the story. A scandalous interpretation proposed by one modern historian even suggests Enlil reflects humanity's uneasy relationship with power itself. Civilizations create systems bringing order and prosperity, yet those same systems sometimes become oppressive or destructive. The creator becomes the threat. The protector becomes the judge. That contradiction follows human history endlessly. In your ears, soft wind brushes against trees outside while distant thunder murmurs faintly beyond the horizon. Even now, storms still trigger ancient emotional responses buried deep within the nervous system. Human beings instinctively respect forces larger than themselves. Ancient Mesopotamians simply gave those forces names and personalities. Enlil, Lord of Wind, Keeper of Order, Destroyer of noisy civilizations. Researchers from Cambridge emphasize that studying ancient myths reveals less about supernatural certainty and more about human psychology across time. The stories show what people feared, valued, and struggled to understand within their environments. That perspective changes everything slightly. Suddenly, the flood myths stop feeling primitive or distant. They become deeply human attempts to explain vulnerability within an unpredictable world. And honestly, modern humanity still does similar things. We create narratives explaining financial crashes, climate disasters, political upheaval, and technological anxiety. Different language perhaps, different symbols, yet the emotional structure remains familiar. Humans search for meaning relentlessly. You sit quietly with that realization while night deepens outside. The story of Enlil stretches across thousands of years, not because everyone literally believed a storm god planned humanity's destruction, but because the myths captured enduring truths about fear, power, instability, and survival. Civilization feels fragile sometimes. Authority feels frightening sometimes. Nature remains larger than human ambition. These insights never fully expire. As the evening grows calmer, you sense the ancient world fading gradually into softer memory now. Temple fires dim, floodwaters recede, empires crumble into dust beneath quiet stars. Yet the questions remain beside you. What keeps societies balanced? How much disorder can civilization survive? And what happens when power decides humanity itself has become too loud? The centuries fold together softly now like layers of fading parchment, while the old stories of Enlil drift quietly through the modern imagination. You no longer stand beside ancient canals or temple fires. Instead, you move through the present world carrying echoes from Mesopotamia hidden beneath everyday life. Because the old fears never vanished completely, they simply changed clothing. Rain taps gently against windows somewhere in the distance while modern cities glow beneath electric light, crowded with millions of people speaking endlessly through phone screens, traffic, and restless midnight conversations. The noise of humanity has become almost unimaginable compared with the ancient river cities. And strangely enough, the old myth still feels familiar. The story of a powerful force growing weary of human chaos appears repeatedly across modern culture. Films imagine civilization collapsing through floods, storms, disease, or environmental disaster. Politicians warn about social decay and disorder. Scientists debate climate instability and resource pressure. Different language, same anxiety. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford argue ancient catastrophe myths continue resonating because they reflect universal human concerns regarding fragility, mortality, and the limits of control. Modern societies may rely upon technology rather than temple rituals, yet uncertainty still shapes emotional life profoundly. People still fear losing stability. For a moment it feels as though Enlil survives less as a literal god and more as a shadow within collective human thought. He represents the terrifying possibility that systems sustaining civilization might also destroy it. Nature, governments, technology, war, climate. The names evolve across centuries, but their emotional structure remains remarkably consistent. A curious study discussed by researchers from Yale examined how modern audiences respond psychologically to ancient flood myths. Participants often interpreted the stories through contemporary concerns, including environmental collapse, political instability, and social fragmentation, rather than purely religious themes. Human beings instinctively update old fears for new eras. You walk mentally through a modern city after heavy rain where subway tunnels flood, traffic freezes, and emergency sirens echo between towering buildings. Suddenly, ancient Mesopotamian anxiety feels less distant. Civilization still depends upon fragile systems. One broken network affects millions quickly. The old river farmers repairing canals beneath brutal sunlight would understand that vulnerability immediately. Researchers from Oxford note that Mesopotamian flood traditions remain among humanity's earliest surviving literary explorations of systemic collapse. The myths endure because they capture an uncomfortable truth. Complex societies can fail, even powerful ones, especially powerful ones sometimes. A scandalous modern interpretation even compares Enlil's frustration with humanity's noise to contemporary fears about overcrowding, environmental strain, and constant technological stimulation, overwhelming human psychological balance. Apparently, even ancient storm gods might have disliked endless notifications. The comparison sounds humorous briefly, yet beneath the joke lies something meaningful. Human beings across every age worry about excess. Too much ambition, too much expansion, too much joy's overwhelming balance. You remember the old temple rituals now, priests chanting softly through incense smoke while storms gathered outside city walls. Those ceremonies attempted restoring harmony between civilization and forces beyond ordinary control. Modern societies perform their own rituals too. Press conferences during disasters, emergency broadcasts, scientific reports, public memorials after catastrophe. Different symbols, same emotional purpose. Researchers from Columbia suggest myths surrounding divine punishment often persist because they externalize internal social fears. Civilizations project anxieties onto gods, monsters, or apocalyptic futures as ways of discussing difficult truths indirectly. Stories make fear manageable, or at least speakable. You sit quietly beside the memory of Enlil, while night deepens around the modern world. Traffic softens gradually into distant humming. Somewhere nearby, rainwater flows through carefully engineered drainage systems, replacing ancient irrigation canals. Technology changes, dependence remains. A preserved scholarly argument from recent years proposes that ancient Mesopotamian myths anticipated later philosophical questions about whether human progress eventually creates risks exceeding society's ability to manage them responsibly. That idea feels deeply modern. Cities grow larger, empires grow stronger, systems grow more interconnected, and with complexity comes vulnerability. The flood myths whisper warnings about that pattern across thousands of years. Researchers from Princeton emphasize that ancient myths should not be treated merely as primitive superstition. Instead, they reveal sophisticated emotional and cultural responses to uncertainty, disaster, and political power within early urban civilization. In other words, the people who feared Enlil were not foolish. They were observant. They understood how quickly stability disappears. A curious footnote from one modern historian describes standing alone among Mesopotamian ruins during a desert storm, and suddenly understanding why ancient people imagined gods within the wind itself. The landscape can feel overwhelming there, empty, vast, unpredictable. Human beings naturally seek meaning inside overwhelming experiences. That instinct shaped the story of Enlil from the beginning. In your ears, distant thunder rolls softly again beyond the sleeping city outside your window, or perhaps outside your imagination now. The sound feels timeless. Ancient farmers heard similar storms while fearing floods. Priests heard them while performing midnight rituals. Kings heard them while praying for victory before military campaigns. And somewhere inside those storms lived Enlil, not necessarily as literal divine presence, but as embodiment of humanity's relationship with power beyond control. The relationship remains unresolved, always unresolved. As the night grows deeper, you sense the old Mesopotamian world fading almost completely into memory. The temple fires dim, the floodwaters retreat into silence. The ruined cities settle once more beneath drifting sand and distant stars. Yet the questions survive. They survive because humanity still asks them. How stable is civilization really? What happens when balance breaks? And can any society grow powerful without eventually risking destruction through its own ambitions? The ancient storm god never answered clearly. Perhaps that's certainty is why the Tudorian do it. So long. Night has become very still now. The long rivers of Mesopotamia fade gently into darkness, while ancient winds move softly across abandoned plains, where cities once blazed with temple fire and royal ambition. You stand at the edge of memory itself beside the final echoes of Enlil's world. The silence feels earned. For thousands of years, humanity feared, worshipped, argued about, and eventually rediscovered the storm god who once ruled the imagination of early civilization. His temples rose high above crowded streets. His priests interpreted floods and droughts as signs of cosmic intention. Kings borrowed his authority while ordinary people whispered prayers beneath uncertain skies. And through it all, the story endured, a god powerful enough to shape destiny, a civilization fragile enough to fear destruction constantly. You walk slowly through moonlit ruins where broken stairways lead nowhere now. Cool wind slips between cracked stones once polished smooth by generations of sandaled feet. The scent of dry earth lingers beneath the stars while distant insects hum softly in the darkness. No priests remain here tonight. No kings. No crowded ceremonies. Only memory. Researchers from Harvard and the University of Chicago note that Mesopotamian civilization fundamentally shaped later concepts of kingship law, divine judgment, and catastrophe across much of human history. The myth surrounding Enlil survived not because ancient empires lasted forever, but because the emotional truths within those stories continued resonating long after the temples disappeared. Fear survives ruins remarkably well. So does wonder. For a moment, it feels as though the ancient world breathes faintly beneath the silence around you. Somewhere beyond sight, river water still moves through reeds beneath moonlight exactly as it did 5,000 years ago. Empires vanished. The rivers remained. You remember the earliest cities rising cautiously from mud and floodwater. You remember workers repairing canals beneath brutal sunlight while priests watched storms gather across the horizon. You remember kings kneeling before Enlil's authority, hoping divine approval might secure earthly power. And you remember the flood, humanity becoming too loud, too ambitious, too difficult for heaven itself to tolerate. Whether interpreted as literal myth, symbolic warning, political allegory, or environmental memory, the story never completely loses its strange emotional force. Because somewhere deep within the human mind lives permanent awareness that civilization depends upon delicate balance. Researchers from Oxford continue debating why catastrophic flood myths appear across so many cultures throughout history. Some scholars emphasize shared environmental experiences. Others focus upon psychological symbolism tied to renewal, judgment, and survival. No final answer exists, perhaps none ever will. A curious modern reflection from one archaeologist described standing among Mesopotamian ruins during sunset, while realizing that every ancient civilization once believed itself permanent. The insight feels simple yet deeply unsettling. Every empire assumes continuity. History rarely guarantees it. You continue through the sleeping ruins, while cool night air brushes gently against weathered stone. Crickets sing beside collapsed walls where temple singers once praised Enlil through smoke and music. The contrast feels almost tender now. Time softens even terrifying gods eventually. Researchers from Stanford suggest humanity preserves ancient myths partly because they provide continuity across generations facing different versions of uncertainty. Floods become symbols for collective fear itself, and fear changes form endlessly. Ancient Mesopotamians feared rivers bursting through canal walls. Modern societies fear collapsing systems, climate instability, war, technological disruption, and political fracture. Different storms, same human heartbeat beneath them. A scandalous interpretation proposed recently by one historian argues, Enlil ultimately represents civilization's uneasy awareness that order always carries potential for destruction. Systems creating stability can also become rigid, overwhelming, or catastrophic when balance disappears. The protector becomes dangerous. The guardian becomes judge. The civilization becomes noise. The idea lingers quietly beside you beneath the stars. In your ears, distant wind moves through empty grasslands where temple towers once dominated the horizon. The sound resembles soft breathing across the ancient plain, and perhaps that is fitting. Because the story of Enlil was never truly about one god alone. It was about humanity learning to live beside uncertainty, learning to build cities despite floods, learning to love civilization while fearing its fragility, learning that power and vulnerability often grow together. The ancient storytellers understood those truths intimately. That is why their voices survived. As the final hours of night deepen around you, the ruins fade gradually into darkness until only outlines remain against the horizon. Somewhere beneath the earth sleep countless unread tablets, broken statues, forgotten names, and unfinished prayers swallowed slowly by time. Yet enough survived. Enough to remember. Enough to listen. Enough to hear the old storm god whispering across history, that no civilization, however mighty, stands beyond nature, beyond balance, or beyond consequence forever. And now the wind quiets. The rivers flow onward unseen beneath distant stars. The temples rest. Enlil fades gently back into silence. Sleep comes softly at last. Before you drift completely into sleep tonight, I would love to know which part of this long journey stayed with you most deeply. Was it the flood stories whispered beside storm-dark rivers, the towering temples glowing with incense and torchlight, or perhaps the ordinary families trying to survive beneath the shadow of divine judgment? Leave a comment sharing the moment that lingered in your imagination. I always enjoy reading where these stories connect personally across different lives and different corners of the world. And if this journey through ancient Mesopotamia helped calm your evening or stirred your curiosity about forgotten civilizations, there are many more stories waiting for you on this channel. Beyond these river valleys stand lost kingdoms, mysterious rulers, vanished cities buried beneath sand, and ancient worlds filled with beauty, fear, ambition, and wonder. Each one carries its own quiet lessons about humanity and the strange paths that brought us into the modern age. Perhaps next time you will wander through candlelit castles beside freezing northern seas. Perhaps you will cross deserts beneath caravan stars, or drift through ancient libraries where forgotten knowledge still sleeps beneath dust and silence. History never truly disappears. It waits patiently for listening minds. So settle deeper into your blankets, let the last echoes of Enlil's winds fade gently into darkness, and allow yourself to rest peacefully tonight. Thank you for sharing this long, quiet journey through the oldest stories humanity ever carved into clay. Blessings to you and your family.